Ever dreamed about building your first mobile app or landing a top developer job? Well, you're in luck because this is your gateway to achieving just that. This React Native crash course is going to teach you the fundamentals, but you don't just get to sit there and watch us code for hours on end. No, if you're serious about learning, you need to be building. So we're going to throw you into the fire right away. You're going to learn by building your first mobile application. The app you are going to build isn't going to turn you into an overnight millionaire, but it is a quite useful tool that you will be able to use in your everyday life. And it's the perfect introduction to more complex projects with React Native if you can manage to complete this one first. So what are we going to build? A FocusTime application inspired by the Pomodoro timer. You see, the beauty of React Native is that you can build both iOS and Android applications at the same time without having to learn both separately. Work smarter, not harder, right? Now, before going any further, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. What happens if you don't know React? As the name suggests, React is a huge part of React Native, and it is something you must have foundational knowledge in. But lucky for you, we have a completely free crash course on React as well. So if you don't know anything about React or simply need a refresher, I strongly recommend you check out that video before jumping into this crash course. You can find that linked in the top right-hand corner and in the description down below. Now, let's be honest. Learning the fundamentals and building your first project aren't going to make you a professional mobile app developer. But who said your learning has to stop here? This crash course is actually part of Zero to Mastery's complete React Native Bootcamp course, which has over 24 hours of additional lectures. Our full bootcamp, which you can find in the top right-hand corner and in the description down below, will absolutely teach you everything you need to know to get hired as a full-time mobile app developer. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's see how you do with this course first. One last thing, if you enjoyed this crash course and find it helpful, the least you could do is show Andre and Mo some love by dropping this video a like and letting them know your thoughts in the comment section down below. That's enough chit chat from me. Let me hand it over to Andre so you can start learning React Native. Enjoy.
Hello! Alright, this is gonna be another exciting one, but before we dive into all the coding, all the building of apps, playing with our phones, and feeling confident with React Native, there's the first thing we have to do, and that is to understand the landscape of mobile development. Why do we use React Native? Why should we use React Native? And what are all our options? Get ready for this. I'm gonna give you a bit of a history lesson. So how do we get here? How do we get to a land where we have apps on our phone? Well, if you know, just like on your computer, applications or apps are designed to run on a particular operating system. We have iOS for the iPhones, and then we have Android for all other phones, like Samsung, like Google phones. And these are the two major operating systems in the world. But the thing is, you can't take one app, let's say an iOS app, and just run it on an Android app. Just like you can't use a Windows application on an Apple. I mean, sure you can, but usually there's different download options. If you have a Mac, then download this app. If you have a Windows, then download this version of the app. And without getting too much into the details, this has to do with the underlying architecture that these operating systems are built on. iOS runs apps in a certain way. Android runs apps in a certain way. So in order for us to target 99% of smartphone users that use iOS or Android, we have to build two apps. One for Android and one for iOS. That's not very fun, is it? But that's the reality. Most companies, when they start, they decide, hey, should we target Android or should we target iOS first? And then from there, build their second version of their app that works in the other operating system. Just like on Windows or Macs. So initially, when Apple came up with the App Store, they said, hey, if you want to build an app, well, you need to use this language called Objective-C, which they created. use Objective-C and you can code and build an app that can be put on the App Store. And then Google came along and said, oh, I want an App Store too. So they created the Google Play Store, and they said, with the Google Play Store, you're going to have to use Java programming language to build an app. Now, here's a trick question. Okay, not that tricky because it's going to be obvious. How do you think these operating systems are written? What language is iOS written in? That's right, iOS is written in Objective-C and C. And that's why you build your apps in the same language that the operating system is built in. Same with Android. Android is written in Java. That's why you write apps for Android in Java. Then a few years passed and Apple said, hey, we have a new language, Swift. It's a little bit cleaner, nicer than Objective-C, so that Apple can say, hey, use Swift. It's going to be a lot nicer as a developer for you to build apps on our store. So now you can use two languages, again, both created by Apple. Then Google came up with Kotlin. Kotlin is, again, a nicer version of Java, makes things a little bit nicer for developers, for programmers to build Android apps. So now, if you want to build an iOS app, you would use one of these two languages. If you want to build an Android app, then you'd use one of these two languages. But here's the thing. Are you stuck? Is that the only option for you? Actually, no. This was just a small subset. Because people can get creative. You see, up until now, we talked about the native way of creating an app. A native way just means the intended way, the way that the phone intends you to build an app, either using Objective-C and Swift or Java and Kotlin. But there's one big problem. If you want to target both phones, then you essentially need two separate teams of developers, which costs money, each one specializing in their own language to build an app that is essentially doing the same thing for two things. Companies didn't really like that so much. So a few alternatives came to be. By the way, I hope you're not sleeping during this history lesson because things are about to get exciting. One of the first solutions that came to be in this environment was the web. We browse the web. We use Chrome, we use Safari, we use Firefox. So Cordova was one of the first things that came out that said, hey, instead of playing around with all this native nonsense that is really, really hard to program in, why don't we just use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that we use on the web to display information to user, to display web pages, and just pretend like they're native things. So things like Cordova and Ionic do something called using the web view. And web view is a browser that's actually bundled inside of the mobile application. And we essentially create a hybrid app. So instead of using a native way, a native view that an iOS or an Android app might use, instead we have a browser that has some of the browser tabs missing, but it still makes it look like an app on your phone. This way, you're able to code an app in JavaScript instead of, let's say, Swift or Kotlin. And that's because JavaScript is very popular. A lot of people know JavaScript. So they can create, if you know how to create websites or web apps, well, then you can create a hybrid app on the mobile phone as well. And those hybrid apps can actually be put on both app stores. How awesome is that? The problem with the web, though, was that, well, you're essentially shipping a browser view inside of this phone, and both iOS and Android apps are optimized to run native code. So no matter what, this web view version of apps was always slower, was clunkier than native apps. Also, Android and iOS have different looks. For example, on Android, the navigation is usually on the top, while iOS navigation is usually on the bottom. And there's all these different looks and feels of Android and iOS apps. So with this web view option, you kind of had to settle on just one look and hope that it looks good enough. So it's almost like a downgrade from native apps, but at the convenience of having to only build it once and have it in both operating systems. Now, one of my first projects that I ever worked on was a Cordova app. And I remember this specifically being an issue where we always had performance issues because we used a web view instead of native views, which are just much faster. But also, we always had this weird app that never looked like an iOS app, never looked like an Android app because we're trying to please both things. Now, things like Ionic have made this experience better, but no matter what, when you use the web on mobile, it's just never going to have the performance that you want. So you never build a serious app, a native app, using these technologies. Now, another option that came quite recently was this idea of a progressive web app. And progressive web app is essentially a web app, that is a website, that you're able to download on your phone or potentially even use it offline like you would with a native app. For example, we can go to a progressive app store, and here we have all these progressive apps that are on my browser, on my Chrome browser, because they're web-based. They use things like service workers, app manifest, these web tricks to pretend like they're mobile apps. And yes, you can download them on your phone, but they're not really native. They're more web than anything. It's something Google came up with, but again, when it comes to performance, it's just not there. So now we get to the exciting part. What if we can have the best of both worlds? What if we can have native code that is performant, but also use this idea of write once and run on both iOS and Android? And that's where we get into this box over here. But this video is getting long, so let's take a break, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. I know. You just want to get coding started, but we're almost done. And I promise this is an important thing to learn before we dive into the code, so we understand exactly what the code is doing. Now, back to that history lesson. We're now at the native-like part. We know that native mobile apps are really performing really good, but you almost need two separate teams to create an app. Web was great because you only had to write it once and it worked on both phones. However, it just didn't have that good performance. Then we have native-like tools. We first had something called Xamarin. And Xamarin was something out of Microsoft. It's a way for us to write iOS mobile apps and Android apps using the .NET framework created by Microsoft in the C# language. And essentially what it does is compiles code to native. So you write the code in C#, and then it converts that code, compiles it to native code. Now there's a bit of extra things that they usually do to make this work. But for now, let's just simplify things. Essentially what they're doing is you get to write it in some other language and then compile it to native, and it works on both phones. It sounds pretty nice, doesn't it? And that was a pretty popular tool with the Microsoft world, but then came React Native. And React Native really took off this idea of native-like development. You see, the difference between something like React Native and Cordova is that Cordova runs inside this web view, right? React Native, because it's native-like, actually have direct access to this native side of the phone. So with React Native, we can have native views. So views that get actually compiled to what iOS intends, what Android intends, so that they're really performant. So with React Native, we can use, just like Xamarin, JavaScript, which is a very popular language, and the React library to create these views that get compiled, get converted to their individual iOS or Android native views. So React Native apps have the same feel and performance as that of native application. Now, React Native came out of Facebook because Facebook has a lot of mobile apps. So they've invested a lot of money to have something that's able to write an app in both mobile operating systems using just one team. Now, Flutter is a more recent native-like framework that we can use to do the exact same thing like React Native. There are some subtle differences, but Flutter came out of Google for Google to try and keep up with this trend. Now, you're taking this course because you want to learn React Native. So I'm not trying to sell you on React Native or anything like that. Obviously, you're already interested, but I do want to talk quickly about which one to choose because you'll get this question a lot. For example, Bruno wants you to build an app. How can you convince Bruno that React Native is the way to go when you have so many options? Bruno's going to ask you, why are you doing it in React Native? Why aren't you using Cordova or Ionic? Why aren't you doing native using Swift and Kotlin? Why aren't you using Flutter? So because Bruno's going to ask us this question, in the next video, let's tackle why we should use React Native when we have all these options. So why should we build something in React Native? There's three main reasons why. One is that it has a big community. Whenever you are using a technology, you want to make sure that there's enough documentation out there for you. Let's say you encounter a problem, you want to be able to Google it and find solutions that perhaps others have discovered. You want to be able to find solutions on Stack Overflow. You want to find libraries or tools that others have built that you can use. If you're using a brand new tool, then it's going to be really hard for you to solve those issues when nobody else in the world has had them. So React Native, out of Flutter or Xamarin, has the biggest community. That means there's a lot of tools, a lot of components, a lot of libraries that you can use with React Native to make your life easier. And we'll see that throughout the course. Next is that big companies are using it. You want to use a technology that has been tested, that has scaled. For example, some of the companies that are using React Native, Facebook, because they've created it, uses React Native for their Facebook Ads Manager. Their Uber Eats app uses React Native. So does Discord, so does Instagram, so does Skype. And React Native is backed by really big companies like Shopify, Walmart, but also Microsoft, who has Xamarin, have actually made a commitment to React Native and have invested a lot into this framework. As a matter of fact, if we look at hiring trends, now this is hiring trends on Hacker News, one of the most popular programmer sites in the world, you can see a clear distinction here between job interest and job posting for React Native versus something like Xamarin or Flutter. Companies are using it and companies are hiring for it, which at the end of the day is always a good sign. But finally, the most important point, because with these 2 points, I would argue that you should use native Swift or Kotlin to build your iOS and Android apps. But the big thing that React Native really helps us with is this idea of cross-platform. Instead of, as a company, hiring 2 separate teams, maintaining 2 separate apps, both on iOS and Android, you could write in React Native once and have it run both on iOS and Android. And whenever there's cases where there's differences for Android or iOS, you can still do that with React Native. You see, React Native apps are infinitely extensible. What that means is that you're not actually constrained to React Native and coding in JavaScript. If you want, you can always write in pure native code like Swift and Kotlin in your app, in your React Native app, if you want to do something outside the framework. So you can always use React Native with Swift if you want to create something that needs to be really, really performant. So there you have it. I guess what I'm saying is you picked the right technology to learn. But we've been talking a lot, and I think it's time for us to actually learn instead of just hearing me blabbering on. So let's get started. Oh boy, that was a lot of slides and talking on my part, but I think you're getting excited. So let's start building our very first React Native app, just like that. Now, throughout the course, I'm gonna keep referencing the React Native docs because I don't wanna just teach you things that you only learn by looking at what we do as instructors, but I wanna show you the process so that after you're done with the course, you know how to go off on your own. Because at the end of the day, the best resources are right here on the React Native docs. What we try to teach you is the process of what are the best practices? How do we learn these things? How do we find out about things that maybe we're confused about? So you're gonna see us use the React Native docs constantly because that is the process that we use when we build React Native apps. So the first thing is when we go to introduction, if you scroll all the way down, there's an interactive example section, which I'll link to. Now in here, even if you've never seen React Native code or even React code, don't worry, just see if you can follow along. All we're going to do is click on this little icon over here. And this is going to open up a new tab where we have some code, an interactive online code editor that we can use. And this is our app over here to the right that says, try editing me. Nothing too crazy. You see here that we also have the web version. So right now I'm just seeing it on my Chrome browser, but I can also do Android. I can do iOS and emulate it. So if I do tap to play on iOS, sometimes you might get this prompt. Now, because this is a free service, sometimes you get placed in a queue that is a lineup where other people are using it, so you just have to wait your turn, which takes a bit of time. Or you can just say run on your device and it actually gives you a QR code to run on your phone. Now, we're gonna get into this a little bit later on because in order for this to work on your phone, you're gonna need to download something called the Expo app, which we're gonna talk about. We're gonna run through how to download that through the Google Play Store and also for the App Store. But for now, because we're just getting started, we're gonna just stick with the web. And just to see that we can code anything we want in here, let's just write a nice hello message in here. If I save, you see that my app now says, hello, congratulations, that's your very first React Native app. But Bruno's not gonna be impressed with this. This is pretty basic. But what I wanna do is talk about the principles, the building blocks of React Native, so we actually understand what this code does, whether you know React or not. We can actually understand what the building blocks are of React Native. Now, in the React Native docs, the second part after the introduction is this idea of core components and native components. Because if you remember, what React Native does is compile whatever code we write into native views. What do I mean by that? You see, in Android and iOS, a view is the building block of UI or of the user interface. That is, these rectangular elements on the screen, whether it's an image, a nav bar, a title, a text, all of these are called views. A line of text is a view, a button is a view, a list is a view. A view can contain a view. For example, here, this big thing is a view that contains another view that contains this view, as you can see over here. And that's how you can think about native development. You're just building these rectangles all over the place. If we scroll all the way down over here, we see that React Native has something called core components. And what core components are these building blocks that React Native gives us. You see over here that we have view, text, image, scroll view, and text input. What React Native does is it allows us to use these components. As you can see in our code here, we're using view and text, and we're importing it from the React Native library. And React Native automatically converts these into native Android view, which is called view group. iOS, it's UI view. the text will become a text view in Android and a UI text view in iOS. So React Native inside the hood is actually converting it, compiling this into a native view so that it's performant. That's what React Native is. It lets you build your own components for Android and iOS to build those rectangular boxes of view. And these rectangular boxes of view is right here. A view is wrapped, and inside of it is a text, and there's the text. That's a view. So React Native gives us two things. It gives us the components we can use right here. And you can see here we have basic components like view, text, text input, and image that we can use. It has user interface. So if you go to user interface, we have things like switch and button that we can use. We have list views that we can use. And then we also have iOS and Android specific components like action sheets, like back handler, because on Android you have the back button. And you have some other ones like alert dimensions. So React Native gives us these components, plus it gives us something called APIs. These are tools that we can use inside of React Native. For example, let's say I want to figure out the dimensions of a user's phone. It gives us the dimensions API so that we can measure the dimensions of a phone. That's it. React Native, all it does, it gives us these components and the APIs. And that's why when we go to our code here, we see that from React Native, we're simply importing a text component and a view component. So if we go back and review, what we've learned is that React Native, the library and the framework, gives us a bunch of components that we can use. And these components are compiled to native code both on iOS and Android, depending on what phone we're using, so that they're super performant and fast. And it also gives us APIs. That is, it gives us information that we can interact with about the phone, like phone dimensions. And you saw on the documentation that there's two tabs, components and API. And those are the tools that we get to use to build our apps. And here's the exciting part. We have these two things from React Native, but then we need another piece. And this other piece is this famous library, React. And in this course, there's going to be a path for you to take if you're brand new to React so you can get caught up. So don't worry, we'll get into that. But because React Native only gives us the components and the APIs, we then use the React library to then know what to display on our phones. What do I mean? You see here that we also import the React library, because without the React library, React Native doesn't know React-specific things. For example, later on, we're going to use concepts like state and props and React components. That isn't necessarily JavaScript. They're React-specific. And we need this library in order for us to combine all these things into a view. Now, we'll dive deeper into that later on in the course, but that's the building block. The building block is that we need React and React Native for us to display the views that we want. And if we go back to the docs and go to core components and native components, at the very bottom, there's a really good diagram that shows us the entire idea behind React Native. That is, React Native gives you a bunch of components, which are called core components. It also has something called community components, so people can build these components and share them. For example, there's a native directory to find out at reactnative.directory to see what other people have built. So you can use these native components that you want from the outside world. There's your own native components that you can build. And then there's this idea of React components. And the React components is something that, again, you'll build yourself. In our case, in our snack, this your app is our own component that we'll be building. Again, if you're new to React, don't get too overwhelmed because we'll go through this as well. But just through this, you've learned something important that we're going to do throughout the course. We're going to follow a simple 4-step process as we build out our UI. We're going to be writing JavaScript code with the React library to essentially do 4 things. One is we usually import the tools that we need. So we import React, and then we import whatever React native components or APIs that we need. We then create our own components. Let's call this one 0 to Mastery. And this 0 to Mastery will have some views, it'll have some style, and it'll have some text. And then we usually can do some fun things like creating styles for our component. And this style sheet is an API that React Native gives us. So we can import that right over here and import style sheet to create styles. And this styles now, instead of writing it inline like this, we might be able to write it like so. So the steps are import whatever tools we need, create our components, add our styles, and then finally we export this component so we can use it in other parts of the app. Remember what I said, rectangles and rectangles, it's all views. We're just building out these views so that in the end it looks like a screen on the phone. So to finish off, go and play around with this online REPL. See if you can look at some of the core components and modify some of these things to display different information on your app. And I'll see you in the next video. All right, everybody. It's time to really geek out and learn about the React Native internals. Now, I think this is really, really important. Oftentimes when we learn a new tool, it all seems like magic underneath the hood, and you don't really understand what's going on. You code along, you follow the examples, but how it actually works is hard to understand. So in order for us to really become React Native experts, and also for you to be able to go off after this course and build your own React Native apps, I really think it's important for us to understand how it works underneath the hood. And I know we're all getting excited to code, but this is really, really important. Once you learn it, then you know it and there's no more magic. So let's talk about that. We've learned that we have our React Native library or framework that gives us components and gives us APIs to work with both Android and iOS phones. We also use the React library to be able to render those views, to display those views on mobile. But there's a few other things that I want to talk about. Throughout the course, we're going to be writing this React Native code into JavaScript files, different components. But what happens when we actually run things on our phone? Well, I want you to think of it as 2 parts. One is the view layer. Now, that doesn't mean it's just always React, but there's always those native views that we talked about. Those views that get converted from something we wrote in React Native to a native view so that it's really, really performant. Things like view and text input are all things that we can use, we can write in React Native, and then gets compiled down to native code. The second part of our code is the logic, right? We have the views, but then there's different logic that happens, such as when a user clicks on a text input, when a user uploads an image or takes a photo, what happens? There's also logic with our code. So we have views and logic that goes along with that, which is obviously written in JavaScript. So the first step is that React Native compiles our views into native views, which is really, really performant. It's what makes React Native better than hybrid apps like Cordova or Ionic. But then the second part is that it needs to understand this JavaScript logic on the phone. Remember that the phone understands Objective-C, Swift, Java, or Kotlin, but doesn't really have a concept of JavaScript. You see, in order for React Native to work, it needs something called a JavaScript VM, or virtual machine. This virtual machine has a JavaScript engine that allows it to understand this logic that we write, this JavaScript code. So most of the time, this VM is called JavaScript Core. It's a JavaScript engine that actually powers the Safari browser. So with React Native, the JavaScript Core engine is used to read this logic, and then this JavaScript virtual machine communicates with the phone, with the native platform and API to tell it what to do, what actions to perform. So when we ship React Native code to a phone, we are essentially shipping this entire part. That is, we compile our views into native views, so that's really, really performant. But then we have this piece over here that is surprising to a lot of people, that we actually ship JavaScript code with a JavaScript VM that can understand it, and a way for us to communicate back and forth with the phone, telling it, hey, do this, hey, do that. I want to dive a little bit deeper into that blue part that we ship. So remember, we have our JavaScript file, we have our JavaScript core, which is the JavaScript VM or virtual machine that is able to communicate with the phone. And remember that the phone only understands Objective-C or Swift or Java or Kotlin. So what happens is we have the native platform API that the developers at Apple and developers at Google have created for their own operating systems. And then React Native has this thing called React Native Bridge. And this React Native Bridge is written in C++ and Java to communicate. So if in our JavaScript file we say, hey, do this because the user just pressed this button, then this React Native Bridge is going to say, oh, in JavaScript, this person said do this. Then it's going to talk to the native platform and say, hey, the user wants to perform this. So this idea of a bridge is actually a very common pattern in programming. It's called the message broker pattern. And it's a way for us to communicate when we're using two different languages. For example, if we want to communicate between, Python and JavaScript, we would use the message broker pattern. In this case, our JavaScript or the JavaScript thread uses JSON, a format, to message this React Native bridge. And then this bridge translates whatever that action is into, again, another format that translates to the native thread of the phone. So again, if we review, we have the views which get compiled into native views. So the phone receives the exact native code, so it's super, super performant. But it also receives this JavaScript virtual machine and the React Native Bridge to communicate with the phone as the user is using the app. Now, looking at this, you might notice a clear downside to React Native. That is, no matter what, it's never going to be as performant as native development, right? Because it has to ship this virtual machine and the bridge in order to communicate with the phone. So when we start a React Native application, it first creates the main thread, that is the native thread of the phone, whether it's iOS or Android. And as soon as the application launches, it loads the app and also starts the JavaScript thread, because the instructions say, hey, because this is a React Native app, we also need to read JavaScript. So it creates a JavaScript thread to execute this JavaScript code. So when a user, let's say, touches the text input or wants to do something to interact with the app, the main thread of the phone, that is Android or iOS, says, oh, something happened, an event happened. And it tells through the bridge, the JavaScript. Hey, JavaScript, somebody just touched this app right over here. What should I do? And the JavaScript says, well, because Timmy over here pressed this button, display this. So the instructions and communication happens back and forth on the phone between the main thread and the JavaScript thread. So the JavaScript thread runs all our business logic inside with React Native. How cool is that? I think this is really, really interesting because now we understand how React Native apps work, but also a clear downside that we're going to have to ship this, and it's going to take a little bit longer performance-wise because this communication has to constantly happen between the JavaScript world and the native platform world. But there's many ways around it for us to still have that performance. So let's talk about that in the next video. You want to hear something exciting? You just learned an important concept of React Native and something that most React Native developers don't know, and that is what it actually does. You see, if we go to the React Native repo here by Facebook, because remember, React Native was created at Facebook, if we scroll down, we see what language or languages it uses. So over here, we see that it's mainly written in JavaScript. That makes sense. But there's also Java, Objective-C, C++. Why is that? You should be able to answer that question now, right? Because React Native, not only is it just JavaScript code, but it is also that bridge that allows us to communicate with the native platform. And the way we communicate with the Android platform is through Java. The way we communicate with the iOS platform is using things like Objective-C and C++. And now we're also able to uncover some interesting things about React Native and actually understand why they are the way they are. For example, if I go to the JavaScript environment section on our React Native docs, we can actually understand this. It's going to say, when using React Native, you're going to be running your JavaScript code in two environments. Okay. In most cases, React Native will use JavaScript Core, the JavaScript engine that powers Safari. We just learned that. That's great. Now, when using Chrome debugging, which we're going to do throughout the course, that is when we test our app on our computer instead of our phones, we're going to be using the JavaScript code on Chrome. So Chrome uses the V8 engine instead of JavaScript Core. So when we test our code on our browser, instead of using JavaScript Core, it's going to test using the V8 engine to understand JavaScript. So this way we don't have to ship the JavaScript Core while testing our app. Everything is really, really fast because our browsers already have this. Now the beauty is that because all our React Native apps have this JavaScript runtime, or environment, it also gives us some niceties like the Babel JavaScript compiler. So this way we can use all the new JavaScript features because our code is compiled through this so that we can use arrow functions, we can use object spread, we can use things like JSX for React, and so on and so forth. But there's also some exciting things now. For example, when you go to using Hermes, this is a new feature that just came out of Facebook. Facebook was having issues with this idea that the JS core that we were running with every single React Native application was really, really slow on Android. So they came up with an open source JavaScript engine optimized for running React Native apps on Android. And this is an interesting thing. So Hermes is a new way for you to, instead of using the JavaScript core, to ship Hermes, which is optimized and faster for Android. And this was a common problem with React Native. Usually, apps on Android were slower than the apps on iOS. And that was because iOS naturally already comes with the JavaScript core. Remember, JavaScript core is used for Safari. Safari is a browser by Apple. and they include JavaScript core on all the iOS apps. Android, on the other hand, doesn't have that. So we saved a bit of space with iOS apps because they didn't need to include the JS core with React Native because it was already on the phone, versus Android that doesn't have the JS core on the phone and instead had to ship it all together with our JavaScript logic. So Hermes was created to say, hey, don't use JavaScript core because it's bloated, it's heavy, it's not as performant. Instead, use Hermes, a new JavaScript engine that is optimized for Android. How cool is that? Now, I know we geeked out a bit about the internals, but I hope things are starting to make sense. And this is kind of fun now, because when we write code now, we understand how things are working underneath the hood, how React Native is able to have native-like performance, but also use JavaScript to communicate with these phones that historically only like to be coded in a certain language. We have some fun times ahead, so let's get into it. Oh boy, hopefully your head didn't explode from all these lectures. We're gonna keep our slides lectures to a minimum from now and actually get into coding, actually practicing with React Native, because at the end of the day, that's how you get better. But I do have one question to ask you, one exercise, based on what we've learned up until now, and hopefully you can answer it. Is there CSS in React Native? Pause the video and think about it. Is there CSS? And CSS, hopefully everybody knows, is a way to style your web apps, your web pages. But is there CSS in React Native? Is there a way for us to style things on mobile with React Native? Ready for the answer? Technically, no. Technically, there is no CSS in React Native because remember, we're not on the web. CSS and HTML are for the web, right? React Native instead uses native mobile tools. So the CSS that we use in React Native is actually built through JavaScript. It's based on the CSS syntax, but a little bit different. For example, if we go to the style section of the React Native docs, you see that with React Native, you style your application using JavaScript, and that all core components accept a prop name style. So although they've mimicked how styles work on CSS, there's small differences like using JavaScript camel case instead of the dashes that we see with CSS properties. And we also have things like style sheet, the style sheet class that React Native gives us for us to create styles. But there's a few things like not having pixels because again, it just natively creates the views for us. So if we go to height and width, you see that it has something called fixed dimensions. All dimensions in React Native are unitless and represent density-independent pixels. Essentially a way of saying that it just figures out the best way to display things on the screen based on the screen dimensions. The other thing it does is that for layout, it uses Flexbox automatically. So although it's very, very similar to CSS, technically it's just all JavaScript because we're in the mobile world, not the web world. Hopefully you got that, and hopefully because of the previous lessons, this all makes sense. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. You see, React initially was built for the web. So React as a library was used to build web pages. Then React Native came along to be able to do the same thing we did on the web, but also natively on mobile. So in React, we would use something like div or a p or image tag, all HTML tags to build components. But on a phone, there's no HTML because it's not the web, right? The idea of React Native is to build for a phone. And on a phone, there's no HTML, there's no browser. I mean, there is, but we're building native apps. So when you use something like div with React Native, well, you can't. You have to use views or text or something like this. So on the web, you would often use something called React DOM to render something on the DOM or on the web page. With React Native, use React Native to render something on the mobile app. Initially, React had the library React DOM for the web, but they eventually got split into two. So on the web, you would use React and the React DOM library, and on mobile, you'd use React and the React Native library. So if we go back to our example here, you may notice a few things that are different than if you were using React on the web. One is that obviously there's no React DOM. Instead, we're using React Native. Then we notice that we're not using HTML tags. We're using native React Native components. So view and text instead of a div or a p tag. Next, we see that we have this thing called style sheet. Style sheet is a way that React Native does styles. So we use this format of stylesheet.create, and then we create a new style class using this object notation. Now you'll notice here that we're not using the regular CSS way of writing margin top, which will be margin dash top. Instead, we're using camel case, which is native to JavaScript. And we also don't have any idea of pixels here. Again, React Native simplifies things for us. It just says 50 and it tries to optimize it based on the operating system, based on the screen for us. So it makes things a lot simpler. But once we learn this difference between working with React on the web and working with React on mobile, all the other principles are pretty much the same. It's just components with other components, using them together to build interactive UI. Welcome back. I want to talk quickly about some of the options that you have when you're working and building a mobile app. With React Native, the first choice is, do you want to test on your device or do you want to test on a simulation? And we're going to see both of these throughout the course. Now, on your device, you obviously get to actually physically see the app on your phone, which is really, really nice. But sometimes that takes a bit of time for it to get transferred to your phone. Or you can use a simulator on your computer so that it simulates both Android and iOS so that you can get fast feedback. Another option is to use the Expo app, which we're going to show you how to do. You can either fully compile your code into an app on your phone, or you can use the Expo client. So that is, you download the Expo app on your phone, and then you can really fast ship your React Native code to that Expo client, and that Expo client app is going to load up on your phone as if you're running that app. But underneath the hood, it's the Expo app that's displaying your application. Now, why would we want to do something like this? If we go to setting up the developer environment section on the React Native documentation, you'll see that we have two options. The React Native CLI, so that is without using the Expo client, or using the Expo CLI. Now we'll walk you through the installation steps here, but always know that you can refer to these documentation and go through everything that you need. Now the reason we use Expo in this course is that it makes it super easy for you to run and test your applications, but we also make sure that all the students can do this course. You see, if we just do the React Native CLI method, there's some limitations. For example, on Windows, you need to actually have a Mac to even build an iOS app. So on Windows, if you have a Windows machine, you can't create an iOS app. It's just the rules that Apple has come up with. And there's also a lot of installation steps that you'll need. For Mac OS, for example, you'll need Xcode. For Android, you'll need Android Studio. So we're going to do Expo CLI because it allows us to make sure that everyone taking this course can actually follow along. But don't worry, because this Expo CLI, which I actually have downloaded over here, I've run these commands and I will show you how to do that later on as well. But I want to show you something quickly. This Expo client, if we go to package.json, has a few options for you to be able to run your code. You can run your code on Android, you can run on iOS or a simulation, you can even run it on the web, which is a new feature. So if we look at the dependencies, we see that we have React, we have React DOM because we have the option of running it on the web as well. And then we also have React Native for running it on iOS and Android. But if you ever want to not use Expo and actually build apps through Xcode or Android Studio, which is what iOS and Android recommend, you can always do npm run eject. And what this does is it allows you to eject from an Expo app. And what we'll see is that we actually get native Android code right here and native iOS code right here. So we can load up the iOS code through Xcode or Android code through Android Studio. So although we use Expo in this course, nothing's going to prevent you from ejecting these apps and working on native by itself. So there really isn't any downside to Expo. As a matter of fact, I usually recommend the path of starting with Expo, and then when you're ready, you can eject from Expo and build any professional app that you want.
Hey everyone! So I want to give you a quick intro into FocusTime, the app that we'll be building throughout this section of the course. Now this app borrows from the Pomodoro style focus aspect of being able to take a task and focus on it for a specific amount of time. Let's say we wanted to code and we added that. Well, the default timer currently is set to 6 seconds, but you could switch it to 10, 15, even 20 minutes. And you can start the timer, you can pause the timer, you can start the timer again and say, hey, I chose too many minutes, let me set it to 10, and it will continue counting down. We're making this reactive app that's going to allow you to track what you have successfully focused on. So right now, we haven't successfully focused on anything. So if I were to cancel coding, it wouldn't show up in my list. If I re-add coding and I focus on it for the entirety, we can see we're building a progress bar here, we're building a countdown timer, and at the end of the countdown, we're going to make the phone even vibrate. Now I've successfully focused on coding for 6 seconds. I could say, hey, I want to focus on it for another 10 minutes, right? I don't want to switch it up just yet. Or I could say, hey, I'm kind of done with coding. Let me cancel it. We can see that coding has successfully been added to the list as something that we focused on. That's awesome. So this is the app that we'll be building throughout this section of the course. I hope you're all excited. Hey everyone. So to start off our journey, what we are going to do is we're going to dive deeper into the Expo utility. It's a software, it's a framework. It is what makes React Native development simple. You see, as Andre said, there are two paths you can take. Expo is a framework that enables you to get started in the most simple way possible. They have a step-by-step guide. They have a community. They have all of the tooling to get you set up in minutes. now they have this guaranteed 6-step process, fall in love, download Node.js, get the command line, all of these steps to get you coding in React Native. And we're going to follow along this trajectory step by step to get you set up and falling in love with React Native, because that's what we're trying to do here. Mobile development for the longest time has been a daunting industry, and React Native has, so to speak, bridged that gap. But with anything that's trying to target both iOS and Android, there's still a lot that needs to be learned, and Expo simplifies that process. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to follow along and get you set up in a way that gets you building high-performant universal apps without any setup just yet. And then we're going to go through setting you up step by step so that you can do the development locally on your own machine. But Expo has a zero setup environment. And the whole purpose of Expo is to simplify the React Native development process, because with anything at all, when you're targeting developing in a multi-platform way, there are complexities that come into play. And those complexities are something that you cannot escape over time as you build out more and more complex applications. But what Expo gives us is the ability to bridge that gap, gives us a lot of documentation, development tools, forums, a custom Slack with their members as well. So they have a whole community around Expo to which you can reach out and you can build out applications. And specifically, it enables you to fall in love with React Native with the lowest barrier to entry. And so with that, let's dive in. All right, let's get coding. We are going to hit the ground running. And I mean that in the most figurative way possible, because when we code, we are not actually going to run. But we are going to build FocusTime. And so in order to do that, I've highlighted the process in 3 simple steps, what we're going to achieve in this video. We are going to create an Expo account. Then we are going to get a snack. And no, I don't mean potato chips, although you can go and get those, and it's always nice to have a snack while coding. But what I mean here is that we are going to create a snack, an Expo snack, a little environment in which we are all individually going to build FocusTime. And then finally, we're going to get into coding FocusTime. Now, not all of these are going to be achieved in this one video, but we should be able to get 1 and 2 out of the way to get you focused on number 3. So let's move over to Expo. So over here, we're on Expo. And the number one thing we need to do is we need to go over to the menu. And if I log out real quick, what we want to achieve here is that I want each and every one of you to sign up. And so you're going to fill in your own email address, your own username, and a password. And you're going to enroll into the developer services. And then once you create the account, well, then we're going to log in. And so over here, you can see that I filled out my username and password. And once I log in, I will be welcomed back into Expo. And so you'll be greeted with this developer page in which you can go and you can see your home, your builds, your snacks, your setting, all of these things that we're going to get into. But the number one thing that I pointed out is that we need to get a snack. And again, not potato chips, although I do recommend. If we go over to snacks, what we're going to see here is that I have my own FocusTime app. But I want each and every one of you to create your own snack. And I want you to call it FocusTime. And then when you save that, well, now you have a completed snack. And this snack, you can run. You can run it over here in this right-hand pane. And the whole point of this is that Expo is giving you this entire environment that you can run a React Native app in and code in at the same time. So if we go over here to iOS and we say tap to play, we're going to run the app that we are currently looking at. And so it says over here, hey, change the code in the editor and watch it change on the phone. So if I change it over here to change, and I'm not coding in the most clean way, you can see over here, it changed to change. So this is the environment in which we are going to create FocusTime. So now that you're set up, well, now we can get to coding. We can dive deep into creating FocusTime, our first fully fledged mobile iOS and Android app. I am excited. Now that we've created our own FocusTime snack, there are a couple of things in this particular UI or user interface that you need to get used to. On the left-hand side, you'll see that we can see the files that are currently open and the project files themselves. And these files are important because this is where we're going to do most of the creation of our components. So on the left side, we can do stuff like creating folders, creating files, we can import files if we needed to, things like that. Then in the center, we have the currently open file. So we can see things like example code or the actual app code. And then here on the right-hand side, we can see how we can run our code. Now, Expo, by default, implements both iOS, Android, and web capabilities. Now, for the intents and purposes of this course, we are focusing on Expo with iOS and Android. So whatever we do may not be completely portable to a web application. But just keep in mind that when using Expo, you do get some of those capabilities, but we're focusing mainly on creating mobile applications. So we're focusing on iOS and Android. And you can also see here the My Device tab. So you're able to run this on your own device. Now, we already saw in the previous video that if you tap to play, you can launch a simulator that is running your app locally. And you can see over here that we're able to see our code as it changes and shifts inside of the simulator. And we can do it both on iOS and Android. If we tap here to play, we can see it happen on Android. Now, the one drawback to using this mechanism over here is that there are limited spots available when running here. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, Expo is giving you all of these capabilities just in the browser, right? But it's actually running on a real device. You're running on a real Android device and a real iOS device. That means that there is the possibility that you may have to queue up at a certain point. There may be a lot of people running snacks and trying it out on iOS and Android. That's why we can look here at the My Device tab. If you download the Expo client on your phone and you scan this QR code, you can run the code that's right here directly on your phone. So let's see how to do that before we get into the weeds of coding. So in the previous video, we mentioned that, hey, whatever we code in here, whatever we do at all, we can run it on our own device. We don't need to use these iOS and Android tabs and web tabs. We can run it on our own device. Now, how do we go about that? Well, if you were to go into the App Store, what we would be searching for, and this is the exact same for both iOS and Android, just a different store. Whether or not you use the Play Store or the Apple App Store, you're going to be searching for Expo. And what you're specifically going to be looking for is the Expo client. And you're going to download that. And as you can see, I already have it installed. So that's great. And so now, just because I have the Expo app, I can actually go directly into my camera. And I can scan this QR code. And it's going to say, hey, open it in Expo. And then when I open it in Expo, now I can suddenly see all of my code changes Now it's opening my project locally and it's saying device connected. So at any given point, if I make these changes and I save them, you can now see them happen live, right? And it is absolutely amazing. We can just see this live on our device. No need for anything other than the Expo app and a quick QR scan. That's how easy it is. And hey, if you're having some difficulties, we can always go back to the iOS and Android tab and make it easy on ourselves. So there's multiple ways to see what you're doing. If you only have an iOS device, well, here, you have the Android tab. If you only have an Android device, well, let's run it on iOS as well to just see what we're doing. That is the power of an Expo snack. It's better than a bag of potato chips. I promise you that. Now that we got all of that out of the way, and now that you fully understand the snack interface and how snacks work, before we dive very deep into coding, there's one thing I want you to do. Over here on my snack, you can see that I have something called the FocusTime Demo. Now, the one thing I want you to do is very simply go to your camera app, point and click at this QR code and open it in the Expo app. And now what you're going to be able to do is play around with the app that we built and be able to work with the demo that is available to you. So let's say mowing the lawn, and we say, okay, that's good. Let's add that. And now we can play around with the demo that I showed you in the very first video. And so you can get a feel of what exactly it is we're building. And you can get a feel of, hey, what is exactly what's going on here? And if we close this and I reinstall it, what exactly is going to happen? And you can try this again and again, and you can always come back to this demo. And because it's in your Expo app, you can also see, hey, mowing the lawn stayed around. This is also a feature we're going to build. It's called storing the focus items. We're going to do that. And we can also clear them so that, hey, they're not a problem anymore. We focused on too many items. So we're going to be able to run this demo locally on our phone. We're going to be able to understand what exactly it is we're building. And while you're building your application, you can always reach back to our demo just to get a better understanding of, hey, what exactly is it we're building? And so over here at this URL, this is where you can find the snack. And we'll make sure to put this in the resources on the video so that you can reach to it. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that FocusTime, our app that we're going to build now, is in focus. So we're going to make sure that it's installed in our Expo app, or you're running it on the iOS or Android tab. And we're going to make sure that our device is connected. And what we're going to do first of all, and you should always do this, always, always, always. If you're starting off with a snack, clean up the environment. So we're going to remove the card. We're going to remove the text. We don't need any of that. We're going to remove the card component. We're going to remove the asset example component. And we're going to remove some of the ubiquitous styles that we don't really need. And we're just gonna put it in a good shape, you know. We're gonna make it simple. You can see here, you know, our app is empty now. We're gonna delete the files we don't need because, hey, we're gonna set up an application the way that we want to set it up. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're gonna follow some good practices. And hey, if you don't want this in the way while coding, you can always just go ahead and make it bigger by doing this and escaping out and then just minimizing it. And now we have more code space. And if you're running it on your phone, well, it's just useful to do that because now you have more code space over here to do whatever you need to do. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a folder and we're going to call it source. You always want to start with a source folder. It's just a good practice. The folder structure doesn't really matter if you're just trying to get things done quick and dirty, but we're trying to teach you the best practices here. We're trying to get it as close to a production app as possible. And so we're going to start off by creating a source and a components folder. And inside of the source folder, we're going to create another folder and we're going to call it features. That's what's going to contain our features. And let's also create a folder called utils. And I accidentally dragged it at a level that I didn't want it. I had it inside of features, but I actually want it inside of source. So you can always go ahead and drag your folders to specific folders. So if I want it in source, I can drag it up to source and then it'll end up in source. So right here, I have a pretty decent setup. We always want to leave app.js at the top level. It's basically telling us, hey, this is the app. This is the thing that's pulling everything together. This is what's going to create the base of my application. This is the central point that is the glue to everything else. And whatever happens inside of Vue, well, that's what's going to create our application. So we may pull in features here. We'll see what we do. Let's put in a quick hello world. Always a great application to start with. And you can see over here, oh, hello world ends up at the top because we have no styling. So, quick padding. Let's add some padding. Let's say, 50. Quick padding update. And you can see, oh, now it ends up here because we added 50 padding to the top, left, right, and bottom. So we ended up in this little spot over here. And so you can start playing around with what's going on here, but we've basically cleaned up our environment and we are ready to start building features. It's always important to take the time and figure out what folder structure you want to go with. If you just start coding, well, you're going to get things done. But then you're going to have to go back and say to yourself, hey, I really wanted to structure things this way or that way. So a little bit of thought up front never hurts. Things will never be perfect on the first try. But try to think about a way that you would like to structure things and apply it. And this is one way of applying a structure. All right, so now that we have our environment set up and ready to get a little bit deeper into the feature set, let's start adding things to this interface because all we have right now is hello world. Hey y'all, I quickly wanted to recap something. So in the previous video, we saw a lot of information, a lot of information. And so with that, we set ourselves up for success. We set up our environment. Now, one thing I want to make sure that is crystal clear is that because we have the Expo app over here and our snack is now connected to our account, in our recently opened projects, we'll always be able to find our FocusTime again. And since we've opened it up over here, in a couple of seconds, it's going to show up in recently in development. It takes some time to sync sometimes. So if you have a snack open that is linked to your account, you can rest assured that you're always going to find it over here. Worst case, you can just open it in the recently opened, but it's over here. And if we click that one, what you're going to see over here is that in connected devices, it's going to show us that my phone is connected. So Mo's iPhone is connected. And with that, I can now determine if I want it to update as I type, so continuously send updates, or I can determine when it will update, and I can even reload the app forcefully. So if I say update now, you can see it goes to hello world. We can now also toggle our preview on and off to have more space to code. And with all of that information, I just quickly wanted to summarize and recap that we have the ability to just code from our browser and send it directly to our phone. No setup required at all. No hard packages to install. Just quickly from the browser, straight to the phone, test things out. It's so easy to scaffold and bootstrap and just play around with things. Now, of course, don't go building any hardcore apps in a web browser with millions and millions of lines of code. You're going to hit performance lag. But for our initial FocusTime app, we're going to hit the ground running and we're going to build it. Hey folks. So I know it may seem like we're going a bit slow here at the start, but that's because I absolutely want to make sure that everyone can follow along. And it's imperative that during this course, you have the easiest time possible hitting the ground running and building your mobile app. And part of that is this phone connection over here. That's 80% of the challenge. The code is easy, but being able to visualize what you're doing is so powerful. And just with all of that, I wanted to give a quick summary of some of the core things that we're seeing over here. Some of the core things that you're going to have to pay attention to. So, as we said, you can toggle your preview on and off. You can see how many devices are connected. Mo's iPhone is connected and you can reload the app. You can see the version of Expo we're running. You can put your editor in a dark theme or a light theme, whatever you prefer. I'm going to switch it to dark theme. If you want Vim mode, if you're aware of what that is, turn it on. If you're not aware of what it is, I would steer clear of it because it can be daunting. It's a whole different skill that you would need to learn. And then you see here, over here, the prettier. So let's say you're typing a bunch of code and you're doing like, and all of this stuff. If you hit prettier, well, it's not going to do anything because all of this code is invalid. But let's say you did something like color white. You see how this is off balance? Well, if you hit prettier, boom, everything makes sense. It makes things pretty. No pun intended. It's just the name of the tool. So with that, we've gone through a couple of interface rundowns by now, and I just wanted to show you a bit more. But now comes the interesting part. So we're looking over here, our app.js, our entry file, where we are coming in and where the core of the application is. Think of it as the tip of the sword. It's where everything comes together. It's where our app comes to life. So over here, you can see we're importing React from React. This is because we want to be able to write JSX. What is JSX, you ask? Well, it's JavaScript markup. It basically allows us to write things like this and have them be able to be processed and understood. And React is one of the core libraries that React Native uses to achieve the simplicity of being able to write React-like syntax without needing to learn Android, iOS. It's the language and the library of choice for making the UI work. But of course, React is just one piece of the puzzle because we're not writing React. No. We're writing React Native. And so over here, you can see we're importing text, view, style sheet. And this import, what this is basically giving us is it's pulling the right components that we need in order to build up our UI. So we're able to input text, like we can see here, hello world. We're able to put blocks on the screen, like if you're aware with web development, divs, you're able to position them on the screen and give them a nice pretty look and position. And a style sheet. And a style sheet is a concept that you may not be familiar with unless you've written CSS and JS. A style sheet is basically for us the ability to write our styles, give our views a specific position, markup, text color, background color, give our text a specific text color, bold, italic, specific font family, give it a nice pizzazz, And then we see here Expo constants, and the Expo constants are basically constants that can be used for specific values. We're not currently using it in this file. But over here, you see one of the core things that you will see. Export default function app. Now, this is a whole mouthful of words. Export default is basically telling us this file exports this one main thing. Now, it can export multiple things, but this is the one main thing it exports. And it exports function app. This is the thing that pulls everything together. That tip of the sword, if you will. It's the thing that is going to build up the UI in such a way that we're going to be building FocusTime. Now, over here where the parentheses open, you can see the function body. And in the function body, we're returning a simple React JSX UI that it consists of a view and a text, hello world, like we saw. And so this view, as you can see, it has a style. So it has a specific look and feel to it. Now, what does that look and feel look like? Well, it's referencing styles.container, object dot, and then something in that object. So object.container. So in that object, we have another object called container, and we can see over here, it's giving it flex 1 and padding 50. Now, something you need to understand is, if you've written CSS before, if you're familiar with Flexbox and all these things, this will be very familiar syntax to you. But if you're new to all of this, basically what Flexbox is it's a paradigm that we'll be going deeper into as we go along the course. It's a way to make the UI fit, but fit in a way that makes sense. And so Flexbox, as it says, it flexes itself out. And so with the container, as we see flex 1, container is the top level. So what flex 1 says is, hey, I'm going to fill everything of the parent. Now, everything of the parent is the app. So it's the whole shell. So flex 1 is basically saying, hey, I'm going to fill the whole screen. That's basically what it's saying. And then padding 50 is saying, okay, well, I'm going to put a padding on the outside from here, from the right, from the bottom of 50 pixels. If we said, hey, do it of 500, well, we're going to see hello world shift off screen. If we did it of 100, we're going to see hello world pop up over here. If we did it of 10, we're going to see it pop up over here. And so basically padding is a way for us to say, hey, where am I? And you could specify padding top specifically. You could specify padding left. You can specify padding right, padding bottom. If you just do padding, it's going to apply to all 4. Padding top, bottom, left, right. And why do we use stylesheet.create? Well, it has inherent optimizations of applying certain memory efficient styling, right? It's not going to always have to recalculate everything. It kind of is a bit smarter, because you could also do something like this and override it in line, but now on every render of the app, it's going to have to recalculate this. So there are many benefits that come from using the style sheet create. And there are many other libraries that you can use on top of it and do more complex UI layouts and all of this jazz. And we're going to get into all of that. Don't worry. But this is the most basic that you can get. And so it's important to know what exactly is going on here.
Now that we've set things up, and now that we're ready, we've rendered our Hello World app. And we have everything set up to start building FocusTime. One thing to note here is that when you're in the preview tab and you're trying to run your app, note that you have the availability to run it on your own device. You have the availability to emulate it in iOS, and you have the ability to emulate it in Android. But also Expo ships natively with the ability to run a native app that we're building here for iOS and Android on web. Now it does this because it uses something called React Native Web internally. And React Native Web is a library, just like React Native, just like React, that allows you to take views, take text, and it transpiles them and maps them to HTML and CSS. Okay, so with that in mind, if we look at React Native is targeting iOS and Android, right? It's a native library. It's for native app development. This course is not tailored to taking an Expo app and running it in web mode. None of the choices that we make throughout the course are choices that are geared towards being able to run both on web, iOS, and Android. We are solely focusing on iOS and Android. This is because this course is focused on getting you familiar with the native ecosystems of mobile development. And running on web comes with its own challenges because we're trying to take something that's supposed to run on phones and then trying to say, hey, run in the browser. Now, that's great if you're trying to build an app within one ecosystem. That's a phenomenal way of getting your app across multiple platforms. But we're solely focusing on iOS and Android. So just note that if you run in web mode, you're going to run into issues for which we do not provide solutions issues for which we do not recommend any particular solve because we focus solely on iOS and Android. And I want you all to keep that in mind.
We have Hello World rendering. Now it begs the question, how do we actually get our content to always stay within the frame? And so over here you can see that we add style is equal to styles.container. And we say over here, well, the padding is 50. And the padding being 50 means that we're padding from the left, right, top, and bottom. So we're essentially crimping the entire screen. Now, not every phone has the same exact notch placement or notch size. And the pixels over here, they aren't actually true pixels. They're density-based pixels. So it also depends on the density of your screen. So this 50 could look different on an iOS device. It could look different on an Android device. It could look different on a bunch of different devices. Well, how would we solve that? Well, we could say, let's take in platform. Platform is a specific library within React Native that allows you to target iOS and Android separately. So what we could say here is, hey, if platform.os is equal to iOS, let's put 50 density pixels, and otherwise, let's put 100. And if we look at that, that would mean that basically on Android, we would, push it down even further. Now, we don't want it to go from all sides, so maybe we just say from the top. Okay, let's just push it down from the top. Well, now 100 seems excessive. 50 feels about right for iOS. But you might be asking yourself, hey, what is the best way for us to achieve this? This kind of feels hacky. This kind of feels like it's not the right way to consistently push down the content in a nice way. Now, it is nice because this is, the top level view in our app right now, right? We only have app, there's one view. And so if we say that everything renders inside of this, everything will get the exact same padding. But there must be a nicer way to achieve this. And so enter safe area view. The purpose of safe area view is to render the content within the safe area bounds of a device. It is currently only applicable to iOS devices with iOS version 11 or later, right? So when we apply safe area view, what it's basically going to do is it's going to implement its own padding behavior, which means that it will not take in our padding behavior. Okay, so let's take a look at that. If we take in safe area view, and then we say, hey, let's remove this over here, and let's use that, and let's get rid of styles container, and let's apply a safe area view. And then we can see, hey, nothing really it jumped up a tiny smidge. And why is that the case? Well, it's because safe area view implements its own padding rules. It's basically saying, hey, I'm going to determine the safe area for you to render your content within. You don't have to worry about that. And anything you render within me will always be within the bounds of the screen. Now you may be asking yourself the question, how would this work on Android? Let's take a look at that. Now when we render out on Android, we can see that, hey, the safe area view really didn't do anything for us. And if we go look at safe area view, well, it says only applicable to iOS devices with iOS version 11 or later. Safe area view renders nested content automatically and applies the padding. Okay. And then in the example, to use it, wrap the top level view with a safe area view with a Flex 1 style applied to it. Well, that's something we accidentally removed, isn't it? We need to add back style is equal to styles.container because we want to make sure that the content rendered within applies a Flex 1. Now, this really isn't going to change anything for Android, but it's important to note that the documentation in React Native often tells you how to use something, and so it's very imperative to read through the documentation. Now, it says over here, as padding is used to implement the behavior of the component, padding rules and styles applied to safe area view will be ignored, as they can cause different results depending on the platform. So that means in iOS, any type of padding rules, which we proved, are going to be ignored. But for Android specifically, well, over here we can see that's causing an issue. So if we say padding top and we say 10, what's that going to do? Well, it pushes it down. That tells us that safe area view in Android doesn't actually apply the same rules as it does on iOS. So the documentation says this only works for iOS 11 or later, and it's going to ignore padding rules. So what is it doing on Android? Well, in Android, we can assume that it's actually falling back to a view component behind the scenes. So this safe area view on Android is actually just rendering a view, which means over here we can do something pretty cool. Remember when I showed you platform? Well, we can take that again. And we can also get something called status bar. These are two libraries that come from React Native. And what we can say is here, platform.os is equal to Android. Then we're going to do something specific. What we're going to do is we're going to give it padding 10 or 0. We're going to say, hey, apply a padding if you are on Android specifically. So right over here, we can go back to devices. We can reload the apps. And so what we'll see here is that the content was actually pushed down about 10. So if we put 20, then we'll see it pushed down about 20. Now, status bar comes with a very interesting property. You can do status bar dot current height, and status bar reflects to the status bar over here. So it internally is going to the native code of the Android device and saying, hey, get me your status bar's actual height in density pixels so that I can always offset it the right amount. And so now what we have is a safe area view that is usable for both Android and iOS, because on iOS, we know for a fact that this is actually pushing it beyond the notch. Now that we have our area view set up for success, next up is to add some flair to our application. And by adding flair, I don't mean like crazy animations or anything like that, but we can start with something simple, like a background color. And the background color could be anything you want. Right now, what I'm going to pick is a color that kind of represents like how I want it to look. And that can be a dark blue. That dark blue is a color that I personally prefer, and I want my app to have a dark tone. Now, as you can see here, the text is also kind of dark against it. So we may want to add style here for the text. So let's do styles.text, and then let's add specific text colors where we can say, hey, the text color is white, and we can do 3 Fs. And then boom, that stands out against the dark blue. One thing to note here though is that these strings that we put in here for background color and color, we don't want to copy these around every time we want to set something as dark blue or every time we want to set something to the color white. So what we can do is we can add a source folder. And in that source folder, what we can do is we can create a folder called utils. And with that folder utils, what we'll add is a new file. And we'll call that file colors.js. And in here, we can say export const colors. And we'll create a map of colors. We'll say white is equal to FFF. And we'll say dark blue is equal to, and then we'll grab the color that I previously had. So now we have a colors map. If we go back to the app here, what we can now do is we can say import colors from, and then we can say /source utils colors. And by doing this, now we can say colors.darkblue and colors.white. And that cleans up the code a bit here. And now we have a nice dark background and some white text. Awesome. That was fairly simple. Now choose whatever color you like. Make the app your own. And I'll see you in the next video. Now that we have the basic building blocks of our app, we put in some style, we have our colors map over here. Let's start by trying to build our focus feature. So in the source folder, what I want you to do is I want you to build a folder called features. And this folder is going to contain the entry point for the features that we're going to build. One of them being the focus input screen. So what we're going to do in here is we're going to create a new file and we're going to call it focus.js. And in focus.js, that's where we're going to export const and we're going to export something called focus. This is going to be the building block for our focus feature. Now let's make sure that we always import the right things to start. Import React from React, and then let's import view, text, and style sheet from React Native. Let me just switch these to single. Now with that, we can basically say here, let's create a view. And within that view, what we're going to say is, let's render some text. And that text is going to be focus feature. Now let's create a style sheet. So let's say const styles is equal to stylesheet.create. And let's create a container. And let's say that container has flex 1. And the view of the focus feature is going to be what has the style of styles.container. So in here, what we've basically made is a very basic component. It's the building block for our focus feature. So we're saying, let us create a functional component that has a view, that has a style of styles.container, which is a flex 1. So it's going to take up the entire space. And then let's put some text in there called focus feature. Now, we should give our text some styles. So let's go ahead and create text. And what we'll do in here is we'll say color is, and we'll take our colors map dot white. So, but we still need to import that. So let's import colors from dot/utils colors. Now, there are certain import mechanisms that you can use to make your imports more pretty. What we're trying to get at here is the easiest, fastest way to build out an entire app with as limited friction as possible to get you kind of acquainted with React Native syntax, focusing predominantly on how the building blocks work and how you can use views and text to build out functionality and get an app functioning as fast as possible. So now that we have our focus feature, let's go back to app. And in here, let's say import focus from, and say /source features focus. Now let's grab that. Let's get rid of our text over here and let's put focus in here. And what we'll see is, oh, focus feature is there, but we missed something. So let's go over here. Text is an unused style. Oh, we forgot to add it here. So let's say style is equal to styles.text. And boom, that should turn white. Great. Now over here, what we can do is we can clean up some of these styles and we're good to go. We now have the building spot for our focus feature. So let's look at that in the next video. In this video, we're going to focus on adding a text input to input what we want to focus on. Because, having text focus feature really doesn't do much for us. So let's go ahead and remove that and let's start focusing on what exactly we want. So if we want a text input is something that we're going to take from a library called React Native Paper. So we're going to take this, we're going to say text input, and we're going to say from React Native Paper. Now, you may be thinking, Mo, what is React Native Paper? Well, React Native Paper is a library that gives us a bunch of components out of the box. And so like if we go ahead and we say, hey, let's go look at React Native Paper, it's a cross-platform material design for React Native. So it gives you a bunch of components out of the box that you can use to build mobile apps and create UIs that fit the eye of people using them. Because we want to enable you to build components that match what you want and what the user expects from mobile apps. So 4.11.2 is the latest release. Now, if we go look over here in our snack, we can see that, hey, do we actually have React Native Paper? So we go look at our package.json and, oh, it looks like it was already added as a dependency. But the dependency is set to 4.9.2 and 4.11.2 is the newest. So what we can do here is we can simply update this and Expo will go and install the latest version out of the box. Now, if we go back over here inside of React Native Paper, what we can see is that if we go and look for text input, it will show us what a text input will look like. On top of that, it will show us how to use text input. Hey, do we add a label? Do we add a value? How do we add on-change text? It'll show us what props are all available. It kind of is the general overview of how you can use this component. And so if we go to our snack and we say, hey, I have a text input and let me give it the label focus item. Let's say that we set that as the focus item and we quickly switch our device here and we tap to play. Then what we'll see is the text input come in with focus item as the label. So we're quickly opening our project and here we go, focus item. And when we click on it, it pops up. So the label pops up. Now, if we don't add a label at all, then we'll see that it will render just the same, but it won't prompt us, right? So what we can say here is instead of focus item, we can say, what would you like to focus on? ? We can put in a sentence. And then when we tap it, boom, what would you like to focus on? A little nice to have. Now the placement of this is very key. Right now it's kind of in the middle. So let's take our time to create the correct layout for our input. So let's put input container and let's create it as flex1. And let's add some padding. Padding, let's do 50. And we'll say justify content center. And now if we go here, let's wrap our text input with a view. And let's wrap it. There we go. And what we'll say here is view style is equal to styles.input container. There we go. Now let's see what happens. Oh, looks like I missed a comma here. So by adding that, there we go. Oh, this is going all the way to the bottom. Why is that the case? Well, this container has flex1 and this container has flex1. So this is now centering along the screen. So if we say 0.5, let's give it half of the screen. What we'll see is that, okay, now it's actually taken up half of the screen and it's centered itself within that. So now let's just say justify content top. And that looks good, but let's adjust our padding a bit. Let's make our focus input a bit nicer. And then when we click on it, it asks us, what would you like to focus on? And now if I input something in here, right, you can see that it's filling itself in. Now, we need to store that input. So let's look at that. In this video, we'll be focusing on getting the input from the text input to be a stored value. And by stored value, I mean we're going to be keeping track of what's been input into here. And for that, we're going to use the hook useState. This useState hook is a hook from React that allows us to store values during the component lifecycle. So as long as the component is mounted. So if we do this and we go over here and then we say return, what we're going to do is we're going to hit prettier here real quick. And we're going to say const, and the syntax is an array. And we're going to say subject, and then we're going to say set subject. We're going to say is equal to useState, and we're going to set null as the default value. And by doing this, what we can do now is we can say here, text input, how would I go about this? Well, let's go look at the docs. If we look at the docs and we look at usage, we can see here that they have this onChangeText property that gives us the text as it changes. So if we go back over here and we say onChangeText, what we can see here is that this prop is equal to a function that has the value that is being input. And let's just go ahead and console.log that value. Now what you can see here is that I declared the prop. As with all props, I put in the brackets, and then inside of that, I declared a function that is going to output something. So if I go on my phone here and I say hello students, we can see here that hello students is being console logged. So what we can do here, instead of doing this, is we know that the value is the first property that is returned in the function. So all we have to put inside of here is set subject, because set subject is a function that takes in a value, right? And by doing that, if we call it with like hello, it will set hello. So by calling it this way, it's basically a shorthand for us saying val is equal to set subject of val. That's the shorthand that we're doing by saying onChangeText is equal to set subject. Now, if we go over here, what we can say outside of here is console.log subject, and then we'll be seeing the same exact thing happening, right? So if we do this now, we can see that, hey, right? All of these emojis are being input into the subject. So we're now storing it in the state parameter, and we now have it available for us to use in any given way we see fit. That's awesome. Okay. Fairly simple, right? Like we already have so much done, and it's kind of only like 20 lines of code. Awesome. So with that, we can now store our focus subject. And let's just go ahead and clean up some of the dead styling over here. And in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to try to save this subject. We're going to try to save it so that our app knows about it. So the next step for us is we have our focus subject here as part of our focus component, right? This is telling us, hey, this is what I specifically want to focus on. Now, that's just for this part of the screen, but our app doesn't know anything about, what we're keeping track of, or if we actually have a current subject. Okay, so before we go too far, basically over here, we know when we change text because we've set the subject, right? We're setting the subject as we type. But we need something to trigger us to kind of instantiate a timer of sorts, right? Because what we're trying to do here is kind of create the Pomodoro style timer. Now what we've done is we've gone ahead and in the resources of this video, you'll find a link to a rounded button component that we're providing for you. Now all you have to do is go over here, copy this code, right? Once you copy it, you'll go back, you'll go over to your source folder and you'll create a folder called components. And in that folder, we're going to create a component called roundedbutton.js. And all you need to do here is paste this code. Now we'll run through it, but all you need to do is paste this code. And basically what it's doing is we're providing you a nice looking button out of the box so that you can just go ahead and utilize it. But let's run through it real quick. We're using something called touchable opacity from React Native. And touchable opacity is a React Native component that allows you to touch something. It creates a touchable interaction. Then we're using a text component to render some type of text. And we're using a style sheet to render some styles. And of course, we're using our colors map. We create a component called rounded button, and we give you the ability externally to add styles to it. We also give you the ability externally to add custom text styles to it. And we give it a default size for you in case you don't want to give it a size, right? So our rounded button by default will be 125 density pixels large. Then we create a touchable opacity and we give it the size, we give it the style, and we kind of add the potential for an on-press event. We render some text inside of it, and that's about it. And over here, you can find some styles. Now, if we look at this in terms of usage, basically inside of our focus feature, what we want to do is we want to import our rounded button from /components rounded button. And that's going to give us the ability to implement our rounded button over here. And what we want to give to it is, a custom title, because we want some text inside of here. And so let's go ahead and do that. And over here, you can see, hey, it's rendered a very, very, very large default sized, 125 sized element or button that is clickable, right? It's clickable, touchable opacity. So like you can see, when I touch it, the opacity fades. That's what touchable opacity does. Okay, so I have my rounded button. I want it to be kind of smaller, so I'll give it size 50, right? Oh, and there, now it's size 50. Still has a good clickable ratio, but I really don't want it over here. Like I want it over here beside the text box. So how do I go about that? Well, we can take our input container and we can say, hey, give it flex direction of type row. This will enable it to render in a row visualization. Okay, well then let's remove the flex off of it because we don't want the row to take up like the whole screen. And then we'll say that our text input needs custom styles. So let's say style is equal to styles.text input. And then let's go ahead and create our text input styles. Say, flex 0.8. Let's give it a flex of 0.8. And now you can see, oh, that's applying wonderfully. And then we'll say padding to the right should be kind of 10. Let's say 10. That's not really applying now, is it? Right? Padding right. Well, what if we say margin right? There we go. Now that's kind of pushing it aside here. And then for our button component over here, well, it's kind of sticking to the right. Let's say that we have button. And let's kind of go through the motions of putting that in the right position. So we say rounded button style is equal to styles.button, right? And over here, we can see that we made a little typo. So let's do that. And what we can say here is justify content center. Okay. What if we do end? So that's applying itself to the inside of the button. That's not really what we want. So let's go ahead and wrap a view around our button. So let's say view, And let's say styles.button. And let's wrap that with a view again. And then let's see what we get. So if we do this and we justify content center, we can see now that the button is centered along the way of this. Now let's go ahead and give this flex one and take up as much space as possible. And what we can see now is that our focus input item is nicely positioned. Now our input container is adding a lot of padding, and that's kind of bleeding out here, making it look not as nice. So let's change that to 25. And there we go. Now our focus input container looks very nice. It's within the realm of the screen. The input is not taking up too much space, and the button is right beside it. And that's about how we want our screen to look now, right? We have our touchable opacity over here, our button, but we haven't hooked that up just yet. And over here, we can add our emojis. I just clicked some random ones. And that's about it for this one. We've hooked up our rounded button in terms of like just on the screen. We've rejigged some stuff around. And next up is, how do we keep track of our focus subjects? So let's take a look at that. We've made some amazing progress so far. But what's next is kind of tricky. Now that we're able to input our subject, right? Now that we know what we want to focus on, when we press the plus button, we probably want the screen to flip over to something else. We don't want to see the focus input. We would probably want to see the timer. So how do we go about that? Over here, we're storing our subject. But once we have our subject, we're not passing it up. So the subject is isolated to our focus feature. Our app has no clue what's going on. One way of going about this is we can get a useState in here. And what we'll do over here is we'll grab this useState and we'll say const current subject and then set current subject is equal to useState of null. Now, what we can say here is, if we do not have a current subject, show us the focus feature. Otherwise, show us a view with some text inside of it that says, I am going to render the timer. And then we'll do text and we'll do view. And then we'll just prettier that. And what you can see here now is, hey, if I add a value inside of here, I am going to render the timer. That's what we're visualizing. Okay, so that's good. Now we know that we can swap between both, but we need to be able to set the current subject. So to our focus time feature, like our focus feature, we'll add a prop called add subject. And add subject will call set current subject. So whenever we call add subject inside of focus, we'll know we'll have to pass it a value. Okay, so how would we go about that? Well, while we're inputting, we don't really want to do anything just yet. But when we're done inputting and we press the plus button, that's when we want it to happen. So we can add an onPress here where we say, hey, when this is pressed, let's just call add subject with our subject. Now, where's add subject coming from? Well, add subject is now a prop on focus. And so by doing these simple steps, now if I say, hey, subject is what I'm focusing on, and I press plus, then it's going to say over here, it's going to switch over and say, I'm going to render the timer. Now let's go and clean that up a bit because it doesn't really look nice. Let's say that we give the text a style, and let's say that we give it the style color for now of colors.white because I want it to look a bit nicer. And I'm going to render the timer for, and let's just say here, the current subject. And let's run prettier on that. And then let's go here and say, well, I'm going to mow the lawn. And if I press plus, it's saying I'm going to render the timer for mow the lawn. So that's our current focus subject. And now we've created a back and forth where in this short amount of code, we've been able to take our focus feature, take the subject that we input into the text input box, pass it up to the app so that the app can be reactive to us adding a subject, and then swap out the view for something else. That's awesome. But now we kind of have another feature to build, the focus feature. So let's take a look at how this interaction is going to play out. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the second feature that we're going to build, one of the things that I want to point out is that we've kind of been using sizing all over the place with different types of numbers. Right here we have 25, then we have margin 10, we have size 50. We don't really have a consistent basis here, and these magic numbers, they won't scale as your code base scales, just in general. Now, I know that this is just a code along and that a lot of these things may seem a bit over the top in terms of structure, or you may not do it this way, and that's completely fine. But what I like to do is on top of a colors utility, usually I'll have a sizes utility where I'll just grab kind of the most general sizes that are used, right? Whether it be font sizes, space sizes, and you can go ahead and export const font sizes. And we kind of use that as an object, and then I'll have export const spacing, and I'll have that as an object. And what those basically will be for is kind of to do spacing parameters like so. And I'll do similar for the font sizes. And that way we can consistently use parameters like font sizes.small, medium, large, x large. And so there's semantic meaning that we're adding here. And if we go look at, for instance, our focus subject, one of the things that we could do here is we could import spacing from, and then we'll do ... utils sizes. And what we can do then is we can, for instance, say spacing.small. And oh, that moved over 2 pixels because sizing small is 8. And over here we can say spacing.large. And let's go look at what that is. And our large is 24, so it's off by 1. But they kind of increment in times 8. Like so 8, 16, 24, it's always plus 8. So it's consistent. And by doing this, we now add semantic meaning. Now, if we wanted to do kind of the sizing over here, we'd probably be looking at an XXL or even an XXXL. But for the button, I'm okay to leave it like this as a 50 because it's inside of the render cycle. So we're saying, hey, this button here that's being rendered out, just give it 50. But for the styles, I like to be consistent and use the semantic meaning of sizes.js. So that's just, a little insight in how to clean up some of, the magic numbers that we throw around here and there. All right, so in this next video, what we're going to do is we're actually going to set up what is in the demo called the countdown component. So the countdown component is basically, in essence, this component right here. And we are providing this to you out of the box, this specific component that's going to handle counting down the time. This component, kind of like the button component, is an isolated component, which sole purpose is to visualize numbers in this box and subsequently count them down. If you go into the links on the resources, what you will find is a resource to the actual countdown component. And what all you need to do is copy out that code specifically for the countdown component, and we'll add it to a component inside of our snack. So we go over here to components and we do countdown.js. So now let's look at what this component is actually trying to do. This component's sole visual render is a text output with the formatted time of the minutes and the formatted time of the seconds left. We take the milliseconds and we kind of divide them by 1,000, divide them by 60, and we have the minutes. And if we take the milliseconds, divide them by 1,000, and then modulo 60, we have the seconds left. So all they're rendering out is the minutes and the seconds. That's the sole purpose of this component, but there's a bit more complexity to it, because if we look at the top of this component, basically what you'll see is that this component has some utility functions to convert minutes to milliseconds. It also has a function to format the time. Now, the specifics of how these functions work are not really relevant for the core of this course, but let's go through them just to look at it. Minutes to millis takes in an amount in minutes, and then times them times 1,000 times them times 60, which converts them to milliseconds. Format time will take the amount of time left, and then if it's smaller than 10, append it with a 0 or otherwise remove time. This is purely for the visual aspect over here, where we add format time, because if we're counting down, let's say 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, once you reach 9765, the 0 in front isn't necessarily something that is visualized. So we need to format it in order to add it. If we don't add it, then you would just see 009876, which doesn't look right in terms of like a countdown timer. So at the top here, we have a const interval as useRef. UseRef is a hook from React. Now the main difference between useRef and useState is that useState will cause a re-render and useRef will not. Also similarly, useState exposes two variables in an array syntax. One is the holder of the actual value and the other is the setter. A ref only returns you one object in which you can set it to whatever variable you want. And if that variable changes, if something happens to it, it won't really cause re-renders to happen on the screen. So when we count down, basically what we're going to use is something called setInterval, which is in JavaScript a function that allows you during a certain period of time to call a function. So here we're saying every 1,000 milliseconds or every second, call the countdown function. That's what our interval's doing. So when we use React useRef, we're using it to track the value of setInterval so that we can clear it in case, we want to pause the timer or in case our component is removed from the screen. That's all it's trying to do. So the way that this works is if we look over here, const interval, we're setting the initial value to null. And then when we come into our function, our first useEffect has this property where if you don't give it any properties, that's going to be the equivalent of mounting the component. But we're passing this isPaused, which is a property on the countdown timer. Now, this is going to be evaluated the very first time paused gets a value, which is either true or false. So if it is paused, we're going to clear the interval from interval.current. So we're tracking the actual return value of the interval we've set if it was given a value. If it wasn't, then we won't do it for safety reasons because we're not going to clear null. It's only if interval was actually set over here previously. Okay, so looking at that, well, let's say we come in and we're not paused. Then we're going to set interval and we're going to call the countdown function every second. If we remove this from the screen, we're going to clear the interval completely, and that's for the safety of memory. Cool. Now, if we look at every time milliseconds changes, so okay, let's go look at it here. So every second, we're going to call countdown if we're in a countdown function. So let's say I press start. Every second, it's going to call countdown. That's what's happening over here. Now, if we look at countdown, countdown is calling set milliseconds, but it's calling set milliseconds with a callback function so that we isolate the behavior. And the reason we call it this way is so that we're ensured that time is always the previously set amount of milliseconds that was given to millis. Now, why don't we just do, set millis and then do millis minus whatever? Well, millis is being adapted as we count down in the interval. So you may get into weird memory states while doing that. Every time we call countdown, we want to ensure that the time passed in, or the time being manipulated, is the time that was previously given to milliseconds. So we do this callback function, and then we're ensured that this value is the previous value. Whatever we return at the end is what is going to be set. Whatever we return at any point in the function actually is what's going to be set in set milliseconds. So we get the previous time, and then we say if time is 0, hey, end the timer and return 0. But if it isn't, take the amount of milliseconds, take a second off of them, and return that. And that's how you see it count down here each second. And that, in a nutshell, is kind of how this countdown timer works. Now, of course, every time it counts down, we need to report progress. So the function or the component that's going to use this needs a callback to know, hey, where am I at in my countdown cycle? And that's what onProgress is for. OnEnd is a function that will be passed in by the parent to tell the countdown what to do when it ends. And that's about it. That's the countdown function component in a nutshell. Now that we have our actual countdown component that we just imported, if we go back to what we're building right now, we kind of want to implement the same type of visualization over here. When we add a focus item and we flip over, well, right now we're flipping over to, I'm going to render a timer for the subject. At this point, we should actually be building our timer component. Now, what exactly does that look like? Well, if we look at our source code here, right over here, we have a view with some text. And that's kind of where we want to put our timer component. So what we'll do over here is we'll create a timer component. This timer component is going to be what gets us to the timer overview. We'll give it a focus subject, and that's going to be the current subject, the one that we just decided on over here in this view. And the focus subject being the thing that we're counting down upon, the thing that we're going to Pomodoro style time. Hey, I'm working on a task like writing a doc, and I'm setting the timer to 10 minutes. The 10 minutes is purely focused on that. We also want to say on timer end. We want to tell it what to do when it ends. And we need a clear subject, which is going to tell us how to clear the subject. These functions we're going to leave empty for now, but we're just kind of getting through the flow of like, hey, what does my component here actually need to function? What does the parent need to tell it? And what do I need to supply it? So now that we know all of that, the next thing we need to do is over here in features, add a timer.js component. So we'll do import React from React, and then we'll do import view and text from React Native. And we'll say export const timer is equal to, and then what we'll do in here is we'll set a view, we'll close the view, and we'll set some text, and we'll say focus feature. And that's what we're going to do. Now, over here, we clearly added some properties to pass into it over here in the app. So we have the focus subject, the on timer end, and the clear subject. So let's pass those in. So we go over back to here, and we can say focus subject. Now we've given this a property. The other ones we really haven't. Let's render this out together. And let's make sure that that currently works. So if we say test, we can say plus, oh, cannot find variable timer. Oh, of course, I need to import it over here. So let me go and import timer from /source components over here, timer. There we go. Now if I go back here and I say test, and I do plus, focus feature test. So now our focus feature, our timer, is ready to be built. So let's take a look at how that's going to go. Now that we have all of our building blocks in place, we can basically start creating the view that we require for the focus feature. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a style sheet, and we're going to do const styles is equal to stylesheet.create. And what we're going to say here is we're going to have a container which is flex1. Inside of here, we're going to say style is equal to styles.container. And inside of that, we're going to create a view which is going to wrap our countdown timer. So we're going to say style is equal to styles.countdown. Now this doesn't exist yet, but let's go over here and create it. We're going to say countdown. Now we don't know what it looks like yet, so let's go ahead and import our countdown timer from components. So we'll go back once and we'll do that. And then what we'll do over here is we'll say countdown. Now over here, if we go and fill something in and we say test, now for testing purposes, we don't always want to see this screen. So what we'll do over here is we'll fill in a test subject for now so that we know that will always be here. Now we can see that it's failing because it's trying to render the timer, but nothing has been given to it. So let's go say on progress, and we'll say that it's an empty function for now because we don't know what to do yet when we want to report on progress. And we can see over here that we are now counting down immediately. So let's say is paused so that we pause it immediately. And let's add an onEnd function where we determine what we want to do on the end of the timer. That way we now can see over here, hey, it's stretching the entire screen. Why is that? So what we'll do is we'll give this flex of 0.5 and we'll say align items center. And that'll center it. Now, if we wanted to get a quick visual of things are at, we can always use background color to kind of see, hey, what are my elements doing? So I can see that, you know, my container is taking up the full length and my background color for my countdown is taking up half of the screen, which is great. So that's working out amazingly. Now looking at this, I can see that my timer is stuck at the top and I kind of want to center it. So that means that the one thing I need to add here is a justify content center, which will take the content and then center it inside of its yellow box. Now if I gave this flex 1, this would fill up the hole and it would be centered inside of the center. That's why we're giving it half of the flex of the screen. Now let's remove our background colors, and now our timer is available inside of our component. Okay, now what else do we need? Well, we need a start and a pause button. So let's add a button wrapper. And let's say that the button wrapper is equal to certain styles. Let's see. Let's give it a flex of 0.3. So let's give it a small amount of screen space. Let's give it a flex direction of row, because we want the buttons to be in a row structure. Let's say that the padding is equal to 15 for now. And let's justify the content to the center. and align the items to the center. Now we've just written styles without actually doing anything over here. So we got to go and validate that these will actually work. So what we'll do is we'll add a view over here with the style of button wrapper, and we'll add like /view over here. So our button wrapper is over here. If we give it a background color over here of yellow, it's not really going to show us anything because nothing's being rendered inside of it, but we can see the space that it's taking in, right? So over here, what we basically want to do is add a rounded button. So let's go and grab our rounded button from our components. Components, rounded button. Now that we have our rounded button, I want us to add a start button. And that start button is going to set the countdown to start timer. So let's go over here and let's say that the title is equal to start. And there we go. Now let's remove the yellow background color. And what we can see here is now we have a nice start button. Now is paused is currently true. So let's go ahead and hook up our button to actually do something. And the way that we'll do that is we'll go ahead and open up the component body, run some prettier here, and grab our use state from React. And what we'll do then is we'll create a parameter saying is started, set is started, and we'll say use state of false. It is not started. So here we can say in the countdown timer, the countdown timer is paused if the countdown has not been started. And then our start button will say, hey, on press, start our timer. So that will go ahead here and say, set is started to true. And that's what that's going to do. Now, if we start the timer and if we press this button, we'll see that the timer starts counting down to 0. Awesome. Conversely, we also want something to pause it again. So what we'll do over here is we'll conditionally render this. So we'll say if it isn't started, show us the start button. But hey, if it is started, show us the pause button, right? And so let's just run prettier here. So if it is started, show us the pause button. And what this is going to do is set started to false. And what we'll see over here now is if I press start, it'll start counting down. If I press pause, it'll stop counting down. Start, count down, stop, stop counting down. And with all of that, we've now hooked up our timer completely to start the countdown sequence. Now we don't have any logic yet around our focus item and what's happening with our focus item, and that's okay. But we're very, very close to a fully functional app. And so in the next video, what we're going to look at is kind of adding the ability to select different timeouts and also the ability to visualize, hey, what are we actually focusing on right now? Now that we have our countdown timer set up and ready to go, the next phase of this is to actually add some visualizations that add proper indications to the user. So one thing we would want to know is, hey, what am I actually focusing on? And in order to do that, well, what we're going to need to do is we're going to add a view in between the button wrapper and the countdown wrapper. And that view is going to serve as where we're going to store the indications. So we're going to give that a style, and we're going to say, hey, padding top is equal to spacing.xxl. Let's do XXL. And we need to import spacing over here. So let's go over up here and let's say import spacing from, and then .. and we'll go get sizes. And by doing that, now we have a properly spaced view over here. Now we need to put some text in here. So we'll grab text from React Native. And what we'll do is we'll create a text that has the style of styles.title, which we'll create. And we'll create a text that has a subtitle view or a task view. Let's go with this, and then let's do prettier, and let's put task. Let's go down here to our styles, and let's say title, and then let's say task. And so over here for title and task, what we want to do is we want to grab our colors. So let's import colors from, and then /utils colors. Let's run prettier again. In title, what we'll say is that the color is colors.white. In task, we'll say that colors is colors.white. Now the only thing we need to do here is potentially give them a font weight. So let's say font weight, and let's say bold. And then over here for the task, actually let's also fill in some text here and see what we actually have. So we're going to say focusing on, and then over here we'll put task. But task is actually the focus subject, whoopsie. And so now we have bold. So let's say over here that we put text align, and let's center it. Then over here, let's put text align, and let's center it. And let's run prettier once more. And now we have our focusing on parameter. And by doing this, we now know exactly what we're focusing on at all times. Okay, so what now? Well, I'd also like to have a progress bar of sorts. Something to kind of report the progress over here so that I know exactly what's going on. Now, one thing I'll note here is that spacing XXL seems like a lot. So let's do spacing large. I think it was large. What did we put in spacing? Let's go look. So sizes LG. So let's go back to timer. Let's put LG. So now it's going very far. So that doesn't look right to me. So let's put small. And it's jumped a little bit. Now, one thing you'll note here is that it's really pushed down over here. So what would happen if we put this inside of the view that has the countdown timer and we ran prettier? Well, now it's closer to here. So now maybe XXL makes sense. Oh yeah, now it's pushed it down. Now it looks in a nice position, and that's pretty good. So you have to play around with your views. And here's the thing you need to know about views is the more you play around with them, the more that you'll find that different combinations of styles with views here, and we'll learn all about Flexbox when we get into Meals to Go. The different combination of styles that you use, because it's kind of like a flex orientation, will yield different results. Now we'll get into the details of all of this and how the flex containers work when we get into Meals to Go. We're trying to kind of shorten the amount of time you need to build an app here. The styles are an extremely important part of this as we're learning, because we have, all of these flex properties that we're using, and we have these spacing variables. But the placement of those views can make a difference in terms of what the visual layout will look like. And sometimes you'll have to play around with it, is what I'm trying to get at. So in the next video, we'll look at adding a progress bar. Now that we have our focus subject visualized, the next thing we want to do is actually add a progress bar. And the progress bar is an indicator that shows the user, hey, this is how I'm tracking towards my goal. Because, okay, the countdown timer is nice. And, we all know, hey, we're looking at this and we kind of are aware that 1 minute, 59 seconds, 58 seconds, and so forth. We can see time, we can visualize time. look at this as a nice to have from the usability perspective. We're trying to add some flair to our UI, some nice little sprinkles that are additive. And so if we look at React Native Paper, which we've been using, they also have a progress bar. And so again, they show the usage, import progress bar and colors from React Native Paper. It's pretty straightforward. It takes a progress prop. The default value is 0. And the progress is a value between 0 and 1. Okay. So knowing that, let's go back over to our snack. So we already have React Native Paper available here. Now, one thing I always like to do is I like to keep the relative imports below the absolute ones. So we'll import progress bar, and we'll do that from React Native Paper. Now that we have a progress bar in here, is that all we need? Probably we're going to create our own colors. So what we'll do is we'll actually go down here. And should we add it here? Let's add it here for now. Let's create a view. And let's say that the style has a padding top of spacing dot, let's do small. And then what we'll do is we'll add our progress bar here. Now, one thing we need to add to the progress bar is the actual color. So we'll do color is equal to, and right now it's purple, colors dot, and what colors did we have? Let's go take a look at our colors again. Oop. Doesn't seem to be clicking through. Colors dot dark blue. So let's add colors dot dark blue. And let's see what that gives us. Oh, we can't see it. That means we need a lighter blue. So how do we go about that? Well, you need to pick something that contrasts well to the blue you already have. So let's go over here and let's say progress bar. And let's add a color here. Then let's go back to our timer and let's say color.progress bar. That's a nice color. Now, one thing I want to do is I want to give this progress bar a proper height. So we'll say height 20. Oh, that seems to be a lot. So let's give it 10. Now it's nice and visible where it's going to count down. But actually, we could also just say spacing not small, which is an 8. And everything will be consistent within the paradigm of the UI. So now that we have that, we actually have to hook it up. So it takes the prop progress, which we know, and we'll hook that up to a variable progress here that we're going to define up here. Now, how do we get variables again? Well, we need use state. So what we'll say is we're going to track a const progress, and we're going to set progress, and we're going to say that that's equal to a use state of 1. So we're going to track, oh, should that actually be 1 or should it be 0? Should we count down from the top to the bottom or the bottom to the top? Well, in my opinion, you count down from 100, which is 100% of the time, backwards. So we're saying that, hey, our progress bar is starting at the full amount of time and we're going to count backwards. So we're setting it to 1. If we set it to 0, then it would track from 0 forwards. So now we have our progress indicator that's actually set. Now, if we remember correctly, our onProgress here has a function. So that would probably give us back the progress. And what we could do here is we could say set progress to the progress. Now, how do we know that this progress is the correct progress? Well, let's go look at our countdown component and let's go look. If we remember correctly, every time we count down, we're setting the amount of milliseconds to track towards 0. And so countdown takes the on progress here. And whenever we count down over here in this use effect, every time millis counts down, we're dividing the amount of milliseconds by the amount of minutes to millis. And that will give us a number that's either, tracking towards 0, because it can be like 0.9, 0.8, 0.7. We're getting the percentage number that kind of correlates to tracking down to 0. So if we do that and we set the progress here, we don't actually need these brackets around here. They're nice to have. If we then start our timer, what we'll see is that, oh, it's tracking towards 0. There we go. Our timer is now hooked up. Now, the one thing we would want to do probably here is say that we'll have a function on progress that's going to track. Well, you know what we could do? We could probably just give set progress to on progress. Because remember, set progress is the equivalent of a function that takes the value and then sets the value, right? So like value set progress value is the same thing as giving set progress directly to on progress. So now if we press start, it's still tracking down. Amazing. We've now hooked up our progress bar. That's awesome. Now in the next video, we'll be looking at vibrating the phone once the timer has counted down fully. All right, next up what we're going to do is we're going to hook up the timer, the actual countdown timer, because it can take the property minutes. And right now we're defaulting to the amount of minutes that is predetermined in the countdown component, which is the default equal to 0.1. But we want our timer to actually set the minutes. So let's say const minutes is equal to set minutes, and then is equal to use state, and then we'll put 0.1 as a default value for now. But now you can see if I control it here, I can do 0.2 and so forth. Now the control here is basically to have the ability to add buttons down here later. But this video is focusing on this, and then the other part is on the end of the countdown, we want vibration. And so React Native exports this nice library called Vibration. Vibration vibrates the device. Very simple what it does. Very, very simple. And so if we look at the usage of vibration, it's basically, it takes a pattern. And so that pattern is you give it an amount of seconds and then you give it an array of numbers. And that array of numbers corresponds to, hey, vibrate this, then vibrate that, then vibrate that. So it's going to vibrate at the first second, then it's going to wait 2 seconds, then it's going to vibrate again, then it's going to wait 3 seconds, then it's going to vibrate again. So if we take this pattern over here and we put it over here at the top, now we don't want to define this in our component because we're not going to change it at all. We're not changing the vibration pattern. It's kind of set. Now, what I want to say here is that the pattern is now vibrate after 1 second, vibrate after 2 seconds, and then vibrate after 3 seconds. We want it to vibrate 5 times after each second. That's what we want to do because we want to prompt the user, hey, the time is over. And then if we go look at what actually needs to be done, it is vibration.vibrate, and you just give it the pattern. Now, if we do that here in our on end, what we'll see is that when we start our timer, at the end of our timer, our phone will start vibrating. And so that is a tactile feel. Now you can't feel it, but it's vibrating in my hand, right? And it's vibrating 5 times after each second, which is pretty nice, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now, if we go look here, in Android, you may need to request for an Android permission with the use permission. Now in Expo, it should default this. And over here, you can see reference methods to be able to cancel, how vibration specifically works on Android. On Android, the default vibration is 400 milliseconds and so forth. And specifically on Android, the odds of a pattern array to represent the vibration duration. So there's differences on how on Android, the odd indices of the pattern represent the vibration. On iOS, the number in the pattern array represents the vibration. So the odd indices here represent the vibration. So if we look at our pattern on Android, what's going to happen is 1, 3, and 5 are going to vibrate, and even indices are going to wait. So there's differences in how vibration happens on each device. And that's why it's extremely important to always reach to the React Native documentation to understand how these libraries work, what specifically we can do with them, because they can also change as React Native upgrades. They may implement specific custom behaviors. Now here they stuck with the behavior of the phone, but it's important to note here. So we've added vibrations to our timer. All right, so now that we have all of that hooked up, our timer ends, we vibrate the phone, it's looking nice. One of the things I want to add here now is the ability to select timings. And by timings, I mean the ability to have different times, because once you start with a focus subject, right, we don't want to predefine a time for you. Like right now we're predefining it to 6 seconds. Now, obviously that's not going to be perfect for you. Maybe you want something like 20 minutes as a default range. And, that's all great. Like if we pre-default this, but what if we had some buttons that allowed us to choose and we had 3 choices, 5, 10, 15 minutes? Wouldn't that make it a lot easier? So let's go over here at the bottom, and right below our start button is where we're going to say, we're going to take a view, and we're going to say /view, and let's make it take the style button wrapper as well, which may push some stuff up right here. And as you can see, it will push some stuff up because this is 0.5 flex. This is 0.3, and we're adding another 0.3. So 0.6 plus 0.5 is 1.1. That won't really work. So we want to, flex goes up to 1. So we'll want to put this down to a 0.4, which is great. And then what we'll do over here is we'll add something called timing. And we'll say change time is equal to, and then we'll just say set minutes. Actually, let's say on change time. And then every time timing changes, we're going to set the minutes. So let's go over here in our features folder, and let's create a new file called timing.js. And timing.js is going to import React from React. And then we're going to export const timing. And what timing is going to do is it's going to return, and then what we'll need here is to import view from React Native. Sweet. So now we'll add a view here, and we'll add another view. And let's take a minute to think here. So we want timing buttons, and we want them to look right. So maybe we'll import our rounded button, and we'll import that from ... and we'll grab our rounded button because we want to have some rounded buttons as some changes. And in here, we'll take the prop on change time that we defined. And this will be what sets the time. Fairly simple. Now, if we went to define a view, well, we're going to need some styles. So let's add a style sheet here. And over down here, let's go say const styles is equal to stylesheet.create, the thing we're all familiar with. And let's say that we create something called a timing button. And let's give that a flex of 1 and an align items of center. Okay. Now let's say that this has the style of a styles.timing button. And then inside of that, we'll add a rounded button, and we'll say that the size is 75. And we'll say that the title is 10 minutes. And on press is equal to on change time of 10 because we're setting it to 10 minutes. Great. Now we need to close our component over here. And then over here in timer, we need to go and actually import timing. So let's go say import timing from /timing. Boom. And there we go. We have our button 10. Now if we press it, our timer has become 10 minutes, right? And so that's kind of the goal we're going for. Now, do we want our timing bottoms at the bottom or at the top? You know, you can really decide that. I think maybe I'd like them a bit more if they were over here. Also, like, they seem to be taking up a lot of space. So let's say timing wrapper. And let's put this back to 0.5. And let's say that timing wrapper is flex of 0.1. And let's try to add that. Add that in. Okay. So let's add some padding to it. Over here, we still had a padding. So let's add spacing.medium. And let's give this spacing.medium as well. And maybe this needs a spacing of large. Now, do I want them at the bottom? Let's add this as padding top. I don't want it to pad the bottom because it's pushing down the content below it a little too far. And maybe we'll give it XXL. And there we go. Now, do I want the start button in this position, like over here? Or do I want it up here and do I want the timing buttons below? And again, it's playing around with it. Like I play around with UI all the time, especially when I'm designing it. Maybe I'll have a design ahead of time, but in general, like, you know, you kind of want to get a sense of what exactly is necessary. And so if I do that, then I probably don't need this padding, which will pull up the button. 10, 15. No, actually, I think I preferred it at the top. And so I'll go and put it back over here at the top because I like the idea of, hey, let me decide to make this 10 minutes, 5 minutes, or whatever. But now I need to add more timing buttons. So what I can do over here is I can use something called a fragment in React, which allows me to define multiple elements without needing to define them inside the same view. So now I can just create 3 buttons and I can say 15 and then I can say 20. And if I do that, then over here in my timer, if I refresh, what we're going to see is that, hey, they're overlapping each other. Why is that the case? Well, over here, we need to actually give it flex direction row so that it renders in a row. And that will allow them to space out in a row sequence. So now I can select 10, 10, 10. Oh, I forgot to update my timing values. So 15, 20. Amazing. Now I have 3 buttons that have the ability to change my time accordingly to what I need. And the last thing that we may want to add is a clear button, right? Like let's say we want to cancel this timer completely. How would we add a cancel button? Well, down here, we could probably add a rounded button and we could say that the size is equal to 50. And then we can say the title is equal to, you know, minus sign. And then on press will do something eventually. For now, we'll just leave it as empty, an empty function. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, well, that's not positioning itself correctly. So we'll need a wrapper around it. And then if we prettier that, oh, we'll need a clear subject wrapper. And then we can go down to our styles again here and we can say clear subject wrapper. And now we got to think about, hey, what does clear subject look like? Well, it's not positioning itself to the middle. So let's give it a flex direction row. And then let's say justify content center. And now it's centered along the content. Amazing. So now we have, 10, 15, 20 minutes. We can start the timer. It'll start counting down. We can pause the timer. And then we need to determine, hey, what do we actually do on clear? Well, if we go back to our app level, we had this clear subject prop that we were passing to the timer. And so basically what we want that to do is we want it to set the current subject to null. And that's what it will do. And then if we go back to our timer, we'll need to pull in the clear subject. And then over here, we can just call clear subject on press. And so if we do 10:15 and we press start right here, if I pause it, I pause it. If I start again, I start again. But if I press the minus, I clear the subject, I go back to the home view. That's amazing. And we did all of that. We added timing buttons and we were able to clear the subject to go back to the home view and start focusing on something else. All in that short amount of code. Awesome. Now that we have everything set up in terms of controls on our screen, the next step is, what do we do when the timer ends? Right now, we're just vibrating the phone at a certain pattern, but there's more things that could happen, right? Like we might want to, after we vibrate, we might want to reset everything, right? And so basically our on-end function needs to become somewhat more complex. So let's go say on-end here is equal to a function. And let's take the body of on-end over here and let's put it inside of this and then call on-end over here. Okay. Now, over here, we basically are saying vibrate whenever timer has ended specifically. But when the timer ends, we don't just want everything to stay at 0, 0, progress 0, right? Like when it ends over here, what we want to do is we probably want to reset the timer up here, reset the progress bar, change the pause button back to started, because you may want to extend your focus time on this particular subject. You may not want to just finish and be done with it. You may want to continue on with that, right? And so with that, basically what we want to do here is we want to introduce set is started to false. We want to introduce set progress back to 1. And then we want to reset the minutes. What do we mean by reset minutes? Well, we already have our default minutes predetermined in here that, we decided to focus 6 seconds on this. And basically right now, when we run this, we aren't resetting our timer back to its original state. Now, this isn't a consequence of us not resetting the minutes. That calling set minutes 0.1 here isn't going to do much for us. They're already set to 0.1. So what we probably want to do here is drill into our countdown timer and see specifically what's going on. So minutes is used over here to calculate an internal state of milliseconds. And when the timer ends, milliseconds is at 0. We're not resetting it. And that's the problem. How do we reset milliseconds back to its original state? Well, we really don't have a function for it. We have a bunch of effects that fire when this mounts. So what we need to do here is add a const reset, which is a function that's going to call set millis of the original minutes to millis. Okay. That reset function. Now, how do we invoke it? Well, since it's a function, we can pass it as a parameter to onEnd, right? And when we pass it as a parameter to onEnd, now it's being passed up to the timer. So what we can see here is that, onEnd is the equivalent of getting reset and then being able to call it. So we've passed our function here called onEnd, which means we now have the reset inside of here, and we can decide to call it over here. And now when we start our timer and we count down all the way to 0, what we can do now is reset the timer back to the original state of the milliseconds. That's awesome. That means that our timer is now in a complete state and we can continue focusing on the test subject for as long as we need. That's awesome. Okay, so with that said, now we basically know, hey, we've completed focusing on this and we can focus on it again. We should be really proud of what we accomplished here, because basically what we have here is an app that allows us to focus on tasks as we go along. Now, one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that, focus time and the timer itself, it's all great having, long times and long timeouts and being able to focus for 20 minutes. But really what is important here is the phone staying awake. And the phone staying awake is something that is vital to us having the countdown. We don't want the phone to fall asleep in the middle of our countdown. We want to see the time proactively count down. I may want to take my phone and put it and lean it against something to see how much focus time I have left. And so what we want to do is use something called Expo Keep Awake. And Expo Keep Awake is a library that Expo gives us out of the box. And what it allows us to do is just use Keep Awake. Very simple. It's just a hook. You put it in there, you pop it in there, and bada bing, bada boom, your phone will stay active. Now, if we go ahead and take this import statement of use Keep Awake, then what we can do is, we don't have this. So what do? Well, down here, we just add the dependency, and it says Expo Keep Awake is not defined as a dependency. Add dependency. And now it is installing it. And now all we need to do is add it here to the top, use Keep Awake. Boom! Our app will stay awake for the entire time that the timer runs. That's how simple it is. Amazing. All right, in the next video, we're going to look at tying up some loose knots, creating an overview of what we focused on and so forth. Now that we have the majority of the functionality built, when I go back to the app level and I am done focusing on an item, what I would like to see over here is something called my focus history. So basically what I want to do is I want to build a new feature here. And don't worry about the red screen coming over here. We're going to build something called focus history. And this is going to be a new fully fledged feature. Let's remove the use state here that we defaulted to test so that we go back here. It can't find focus history. That's completely fine. This is a new feature we want to build. And basically what we want to do is we want to pass it the focused items, or you know what? Let's pass it something called the history. Let's call it the history. And this is going to be the history of items that we focused on. Now we're not currently tracking that or storing that in any way. So, use state, we're going to track history and we're going to set history. And that's going to be a use state of an empty array. Now, anytime, history items come in, they're going to be pushed into this focus history. And this focus history is going to visualize us a list of focus items. So we're going to build a new feature and we're going to call it focus history.js. Now, as with all other components, import React from React. Let's import view and text from React Native. And then what we'll do is we'll export here, export const focus history. And what that's going to be is it's going to be a component that returns us a view, right, for now. And within that view is going to be text. And it's just going to say focus history will be built here. And that's all we're going to put in there for now. Now we'll go back to our feature over here and we have to import focus history from /source, and then we'll go down to focus history from the features. Why isn't it visible anywhere? What's going on here? Well, basically, our focus feature is taking in the entire view. So it's over here all the way at the bottom. And it being all the way at the bottom isn't great. So we're going to have to go look at focus and see what it's doing internally. And now that we know that, this container is basically just this feature, what we can do is we can give this 0.2 or even 0.1. We don't need that much space. Or we could just let it auto grow, right? And by not giving it a specific flex, it's just going to take up the space that it needs to take up. That's great. And so if we go over here back to our app, you can see that focus history is now all the way up here. Now it's in dark text, but we've made focus only take up the space that it actually requires. And so from there, we can start building out our focus history. So we're passing in our history, which is an empty array as of right now. And over here, we can see focus history is taking history. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to ensure that, if we don't have a history at all, or we don't have a history.length, let's just not render anything out. Let's just keep it very simple. We don't want to see the focus history if we haven't focused on anything. And then what we would like to do is kind of build out a title. So what we're going to grab here is we're going to grab style sheet. And we're going to do, as we always do, const styles is equal to style sheet dot create. And what we're going to put in here is we're going to put in a title. And we're going to grab our colors from our colors map. So we're going to import colors from /utils colors. And we're going to say over here, color white, colors.white. That's the first thing we need to do. And then we can do font size. And we can say font, and then we'll grab font sizes. So let's grab font sizes from sizes. I think it's utils sizes. So let's grab font sizes dot large. And over here, what we'll do is we'll say style is equal to styles dot and title. Boom. And with that, let's disable this line for a second and see if our styles come through. Okay, focus feature will be built here. Now, the first thing we're going to do over here is while we build this feature, let's fill up our array with something so that we can figure it out. Temp feature focused. So we go back to our focus history. We go back over here. And the one thing we want to do is we want to text align center so that the text is centered on the screen. But we don't want this title to be focus featured. We want it to be, what should we fill in here? Things we've focused on. And now that we do that, you can see like it looks a bit off. Like I don't want it to be this large. So let's put it to medium. That looks a bit better. But centering it really doesn't feel right. Like it looks a bit off on the screen. So let's remove that. And then over here, this doesn't look right because it doesn't have any padding. So let's add some padding to it. And let's say we'll take the spacing here. And let's say spacing dot medium. And that way it doesn't stick to the sides of the screen. Let's add a comma here. Boom, things we focused on. And maybe we'll make it font weight and we'll say bold. There we go. That's nice. Now that we have that, we basically need to figure out, okay, how am I going to visualize things onto the screen? And so for that, we're going to need something called flatlist. Flatlist is an interface of React component, React Native component specifically, that allows us to render out lists of items. And when we look at it, its very basic usage is you give it an array of data. You tell it the shape of your item. You define the function that's going to render out each individual item. And then you give it data. You give it the render function that it requires. And you can potentially give it a key extractor. Now, key extractors in React Native are used to extract the unique key for a given element. Key is used for caching in React to track the item ordering. The default behavior of flat list is to look for item.key. So it expects an item in an array to be an object. It's looking for item.key. Then it'll look for item.id. If it can't find either, it will just use index. Now, keys are an important concept in React lists for performance, but also ordering and React diffing when dynamic elements come into the list. If you just use index, if you're trying to insert things in the middle of a data array, what could happen is that things start jumping around and things don't look right. So it's important to use unique keys whenever you do this. Now, it's not absolutely necessary. And in this specific scenario, I don't necessarily see a need since we're not dynamically injecting in the middle of arrays and things like that. So we could fall back to index here. It's important to know, though, that if you're using more complex data shapes, always use keys. So what we're going to do here is we're going to grab flat list. And what we'll do is we'll define the flat list below our text. We'll say flat list. And now we need our data array. Well, our data array is equal to our history. We're going to say render item is equal to render item. And we'll define render item up here. After this, we'll say render item is equal to. And the default behavior for us will be to use text. And what we'll say is we'll take an item and we'll render out item. Now, by doing this, what we'll visualize is black text on the screen that just shows us what we put into the array. And the default key will be the index, which is okay for our use case right here, right now. Now, one of the things we want to do, though, is kind of create a item and give it a specific look, because we don't want it to just be like any old item. So let's give it font size medium, just like we did over here. And we'll make it white as well. And then let's give it to the item. Style is equal to styles.item. And over here, we can now see that our item is being rendered out. Now, we don't want to apply padding to everything. So let's go create a container class here. And then let's say spacing.medium. Let's format with prettier. And let's say style is equal to styles.container. Boom. Now, I want the padding top on each item to be small to give it a little bit of spacing. And let's see what that does. And I want every item to have kind of a indicator that they are an item. Oop, not right there. Let's do it over here. There we go. Now we can see what we focused on in a list. And it's a flat list. So eventually, when it reaches a certain size, it should be scrollable. Now let's make sure that this is flex 1 so that it takes up the full space. And then now we can see, hey, now I can actually scroll it. When we didn't give this flex 1, it was only filling in the space it required, which doesn't allow us to scroll. But when we apply flex 1 right here, now our flat list is taking up all of the space it requires. So now we can scroll it. Nice little interactive feature. Now that we have all of that working, in the next video, let's look at how we can fill up our focus list with the items that we focused on. Alrighty, so now that we have our focus history rendering out, let's go back to the app and let's go look at what we actually need to do to fill up this array. Well, every time the timer ends, we know we've successfully focused on something. So the most basic use case here would be to do something along the lines of, well, we saw that in timer, when we call the on end, well, we're not calling the actual on timer end. So we'll grab that from over here. We'll go back to our timer. And what we want to do here is on timer end, we want to take the subject that we were focused on, the focus subject. And before that is cleared, we want to pass it back up, right? We may focus on it multiple times, and that's completely fine. We'll store the amount of times we focused on something. That way we know. So every time the timer ends, we know we successfully focused on something. So all we have to do here is take in the subject that was focused on, and we'll set the history to be ... history, and we'll add in the subject. So every time we focus on anything, now it will be added to the list. So now if I do test and then I start it and I wait for it to actually complete its cycle, when it's done vibrating, it has now called on timer end. Now if I say like I'm done focusing on this test item and I clear it, we can see, hey, I've successfully focused on test. Now if I do failed, right, because this is going to be one that we fail, and I say I'm going to focus on this, and hey, I'm like, no, I'm done, and I didn't wait for the timer to finish. Well, I didn't successfully actually focus on it. So why would I keep track of it? It's not something I actually focused on. It's something that I tried to focus on, but I did not complete. So now we can add like test2, and we can see how that works. And if I start it and I wait for it to actually complete here, now once it completes and my phone starts vibrating, I know I've successfully completed a round of concentration against test2. And if I clear here, things we focus on, test2. And so this list will continue to grow and grow and grow. And that is amazing. So now we basically can keep track of everything we've focused on in one go, in one app. Isn't that awesome? Now, one final thing we should look at here is in our focus history, we defaulted to not rendering out anything when we didn't have a length. But what we should actually do is say, we haven't focused on anything yet. And that will give someone the indication that, hey, we haven't actually focused on anything yet. We kind of still need to go through the motion. So you can give them the indication of, hey, we need to start over. We need to start here in some way, shape, or form. Now we can design this any given way we want, right? We could put it in the center of the screen. We could do all types of things with it. But in essence here, now if I go test and I say plus, and I start pausing and starting, once this actually completes, that's when we know that when the phone vibrates, I've completed, and hey, things we focused on, test. Awesome.
Congrats on making it all the way until the end. Learning is one of the hardest things you can do in life, but you're clearly dedicated, so make sure to pat yourself on the back. But now is not the time to get too comfortable. As mentioned at the beginning of the course, this is only the start to mastering React Native. There is still so much more to learn. Your next step is to come join Zero to Mastery and take the rest of Mo and Andrei's complete React Native course, where there is a giant project waiting for you. And I truly mean giant. If you thought the FocusTime app was impressive, wait until you see this. Oh, and the best part, by joining Zero to Mastery, you get access to our private Discord community where you can get help from experts like Mo, Andrei, and the rest of the instructor team. Don't miss out, click the video on your screen to get a glimpse of our supportive community. One last thing, I promise. If you found this video helpful, the least you can do is show Mo and Andre some love by dropping this video a like and leaving a question, comment, or feedback down below. Alright, that's it for me, and I look forward to seeing you inside the Zero to Mastery Academy.